Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. We got some people, I think, that are stuck in traffic, but we're going to begin anyway. We have a couple of minutes of announcements before we actually have our first speaker. Let me thank you very much for being here. This is our 10th annual Act of San Mateo, and so we're kind of celebrating a little bit, having a birthday for us. For many of you, you remember that our very first speaker was Gil Panaloza, and he was the America Should Be Walking guy, and he set us off on a tone where we began Streets Alive, Parks Alive, and we tried to close El Camino and have a major San Mateo County walk. We weren't successful, but Gil really inspired us, and he keeps in touch and wants to know how everybody is in San Mateo County occasionally. So we're really happy that you're here to join us for our 10th anniversary. We have the Office of Sustainability out in the hallway, and they are featuring today their home energy and water saving toolkit that you can pick up, and every library in the San Mateo County Library System has them for their availability. So take a look at those. I want to thank Kathleen Beasley. She's the manager of the Belmont Library. She is so kind to host us every year that we do this conference. And as you know, the San Mateo County Library System is just a gem, and this is a real gem right here in Belmont. So I hope you enjoy our program today. I think it's going to be very interesting. We've got some distinguished speakers, and we're going to talk about migration. But before we do, I'd like to introduce another one of our hosts, the Mayor of Belmont, Davina Hurt.
Indeed, my name is Davina Hurt. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome all of you here to the Belmont Library, one of our crown jewels here in Belmont, next to our amazing open space and parks. And I would like to let you all know on April the 13th, Belmont will be celebrating Earth Day in Twin Pines, so I hope to see all of you there. I also would like to thank the library and Supervisor Groom and all the community partners for this amazing exploration in migrating through change in San Mateo County. And also giving me an opportunity to kind of kick this all off. Technology makes our lives so much easier, but there are things that not even Apple can design to perfection, and that we require and prefer to make our lives improved and fulfilling. Things unimaginable to live without. However, we don't feel connected or integrated to the environment when we have a desire to protect it. Now, imagine looking up in the sky, as one eyewitness did in the 1800s, and seeing birds blotting out the sun. And I don't mean hundreds or thousands, but millions. And one person stated the unbelievable number of 2 billion soaring birds. On that number, I had to pause and wonder how much mead or absinthe they were drinking when they said that number. But for many, this was the reality. Now, to give you a better perspective, there are 260 million rock pigeons in the world today. Imagine 8 times that, all flying at the same time in a connected mass. An amazing sight to see and hear, hopefully not to feel. The flapping of the wings, the beauty of blues and reds, a symphony of sounds, the air moving over you with their flight. John James Audubon stated that it's like a hard gale at sea passing through the rigging of a close reef vessel from a distance. Now imagine there's not one bird left. There's nothing, utter silence. Would you grieve? Would you be more angry or upset based upon how the extinction occurred? Would you even care and have a next attitude? Well, these birds whittled down to just 2 by 1910. and they were patriotically named George and Martha. Martha was then the very last passenger pigeon in the Cincinnati Zoo. She eventually passes, and then there was nothing remaining in as little as 50 years. There's nothing remaining of these birds but drawings. I was lucky to have visited the John James Audubon Museum in Key West, where he had meticulously drawn pictures of these birds and many others. We have a record, but nothing is as good as the actual thing. What if all the amazing banana slugs in San Mateo County, or the water dogs in Water Dog Park could be or would be eliminated? Imagine the very last bee dying at your feet, or the monarch butterfly migrating completely out of this area. I know it sounds a little apocalyptic, but these questions highlight and bring to attention the importance of us caring and paying attention to the world around us and those details, and evaluating constantly how we affect, through our behaviors, technology, and the climate. Because today, once it's gone, it's gone. The story of the passenger pigeon, to me, is just a poignant example of nature's abundance and humanity's ability to exhaust seemingly endless riches. When my daughter and I talked about this, we were blown away at how the change occurred so quickly, and wondered why there was no effort to save them. We agreed that there were many everyday distractions, just like today. Then, thousands of Americans were migrating from the farms to the cities. Half the children lived in poverty. Most teens didn't attend school. People mainly labored in factories or fields. Only 8,000 cars in the country, and .com communication meant the telegraph. A time when there were different kinds of distractions from today, where they were life or death distractions, but distractions nonetheless. Today, there are many distractions beyond just survival issues. The artist Brandon Boulanger stated that as humans, he says, we have a very difficult time conceptualizing extinction, even coming to terms with our own short lifespans, let alone thinking that an entire group of organisms could be gone forever. With this as a backdrop of understanding, what is our role in migrating changes and preventing future extinctions? Protecting our natural resources so that things we love today don't go the way of the passenger pigeons. Barry Yeoman stated in the 100th year of Martha's passing that if public disinterest helped exterminate the passenger pigeon, then one modern day parallel might be public skepticism about climate change. There are opportunities for wise conservation of what remains of our gifts of nature. I look forward to being inspired by the speakers this morning. And while we all know that the one thing that is constant is change, I look forward to walking away with a keener and more purposeful sense of protecting our natural resources and learning more about what makes San Mateo County unique and worth preserving. Welcome to Belmont.
Thank you, Davina. And thanks again to Belmont and Belmont Library for hosting us for this wonderful morning of ours. So we're going to kick it off now with our very first speaker, Dr. Alan Fish. He's the lead contact for Golden Gate Raptor Observatory and has a particular interest in bird population responses to urban development, climate change, and other human pressures. He has received awards for his contribution to hawk migration study and conservation. So please welcome Dr. Alan Fisher.
First of all, I'm going to just mention I'm not a doctorate, but I did a fabulous Bachelor of Science Zoology at UC Davis, partly under the auspices of Dr. Shapiro, who will be speaking to you later today. So, just let me get coordinated on my forward, backwards. So thanks for having me here today. I'm going to talk quickly because I usually go for the hour talk, and this is unusual for me to go for this haiku 30 minutes, but I have a lot I want to say. I have cut a lot of things out, but this is an exciting chance to speak broader about the work of migration and culture in the culture of the Bay Area. I'm going to go right to the beginning of the hawk migration culture in the modern era, which is, of course, Hawk Mountain, Pennsylvania, and the Kittatinny Ridge. Kittatinny Ridge is an elbow in the Appalachians, and back in 1932, this was really one of the first raptor migration spots known to modern biologists, except it wasn't biologists who were monitoring it in 1932. In 1932, during the Depression, a Pennsylvania Game and Fish Department would give you $5 for every goshawk that you brought in dead. We shot raptors in those days, and it makes us aghast and shocked and horrified and morally superior to think about that, but I'll just tell you, my grandmother in Woodside, California was shooting Cooper's hawks off the chicken pen as well. I mean, all of our ancestors were doing that. These were vermin. Hawk Mountain was a migration spot, but this is basically what it looked like when the raptors were shot and the goshawks were collected. Brilliant, by the way, the Pennsylvania Game and Fish Department used goshawks as their target bird because it meant that nobody had, like a binoculars or a Peterson guide. They just shot everything. So they shot everything and they left everything except the goshawks. And this is what was found out about. This photograph and a bunch like it were taken by a young birdwatcher named Richard Poe, P-O-U-G-H. Richard Poe, I'll just mention later, became director, founder of a nonprofit called the Nature Conservancy because he was so inspired by the story of Hawk Mountain that you could buy lands to protect it for nature. He bought these photos to the New York Audubon Society. New York Audubon Society had a ramble of activity in 1933-34 winter, and the net result was Hawk Mountain was purchased. The mountain sanctuary was created, probably the first non-game wildlife refuge in the United States, the first refuge that wasn't used in order to eat the animal that you were refuging in it. And this man, Maurice Brune, was hired to be the hawk counter so that he could keep track of what was being saved with the investment in buying this land. Fortunately, Mrs. Brune stood by the gate every fall and told generations of coal miners they couldn't come in here with their guns anymore. And I imagine if the roles were reversed, he'd have been dead in a day. But she managed to keep the coal miners at bay. He counted the hawks going by to keep track of what was being saved. And the net result was he started the first wildlife monitoring system for raptors that we know about today and started a data system that we are able to see. Over many, many years, a lot of bird people and nature people went up to visit Hawk Mountain. Probably the most famous is Rachel Carson, though I'm told that Registrar Peterson talks about sitting down to a plate of sharp-shinned hawk early in the 30s. But Rachel Carson, there she is up there at Hawk Mountain taking a look. She did annual trips starting in 1946 with her good friend Shirley that she did field trips with. And what I like to imagine is around 1960, she was working hard on her book. She knew she was dying of cancer. She was trying to make the case that DDT was, of course, impacting raptors for Silent Spring. And she managed to tap the shoulder of her buddy, Maurice Brune, and they had a conversation something like this. Okay, it might have been a little different, but this is my modern dramatic this incredible moment. And this incredible moment is this person who's been hired for his job to count birds really hadn't thought, in spite of the passenger pigeon story that we just heard about, really hadn't thought about the potential disappearance of birds from Hawk Mountain. And before I leave that, let me just say the thing that she learned from looking in 1960 at Maurice Brune's data, you can find in Silent Spring. It's actually 3 or 4 pages on Hawk Mountain. But it was the complete disappearance, not complete, but near disappearance of the bald eagle, near disappearance of the osprey and the peregrine falcon, and mostly disappearance of young birds. So she was able to figure out, just from studying hawk migration numbers, that young birds were being impacted potentially by DDT, which 7 years later, biochemists in Britain figured out that DDT binds up calcium in the bird's body, in the female bird's body. Calcium is laid in the egg in a thinner shell than it should be, and if it's at least 11% thinner than the original egg should be, then the egg cracks and the female cracks her own eggs, and there's no reproductive season that year. So that's really what incredible work that was done from the hawk migration work. So these raptor migration sites all over the world are really critical bird of prey migration sites. We have something like 360 diurnal raptor species, and I'll tell you about a few of them in just a minute. You can see here from this map that a lot of these migration sites are, of course, the ones that we know about are in places where there's some emphasis on Western teaching and Western stories. We're getting better and better at reaching into the more mysterious parts of the world and finding the migration sites. A lot of times they're on coast ranges where raptors are not wanting to cross over open water. They're on ridge lines where the amount of wind and the amount of ridgeline lift is a little bit higher. So the raptor migration site at the Golden Gate started in 1983-84. We're part of the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy and the National Park Service. We're kind of a nonprofit program hybrid embedded in the parklands, which is a wonderful way to maneuver and bring volunteers in and create a community group inside the parklands, which I'm pretty pleased with. We've been active for 37 years. 1972 was really the watershed year for California ornithology, as you can tell from this picture where I started dressing like an owl. That's my big brother Randy. I was a student at Selby Lane School in Redwood City, so I'm a child of the county. And it was also the year that the ornithologist at California Academy of Sciences, Dr. Laurie Binford, discovered that there was a migration coming through the Marin Headlands and right across San Francisco every fall. So we're looking at Hawk Hill, the Marin Headlands, San Francisco's skyline in the background. We're looking west to east through the Golden Gate Bridge Towers. And that's Hawk Hill. It's that last little bump of land before you get to the Golden Gate right there. So raptors tend to stay off of the water. They don't want to cross over open water. They tend to like a ridgeline because it's where breezes most powerfully provide updrafts for them. And they tend to migrate down through the peninsula. So just as San Francisco and Marin are what we call bottlenecks for raptor migration and bird migration of all kinds, so is Belmont. We're right in the middle of this part of the peninsula, and it's a very important part to protect this raptor migration, which proceeds nationally and internationally as well. There's many raptors, and raptors is kind of an interesting word because it's a Linnaeus word from the 1750s that really wraps up hooked bills, sharp talons, big eyesight, and because Linnaeus didn't have access to DNA, he threw the owls in and the shrikes in and the vultures in with all of what we call the diurnal raptors. We're pretty much focused at Golden Gate and in migration on the diurnal raptors, but many of these raptors have a chance of migrating. So 19 species, I'm not going to go through each of them, but what I want you to think about is the red-tailed hawk or the red-shouldered hawk, a common local bird that might spend, people say to me, raptors don't migrate, my red-tails never leave the Bay Area. And I believe you, that's true, but some red-tailed hawks migrate to Mexico. Some red-tailed hawks have migrated from Alaska. The rough-legged hawk that you see there in the middle is a tundra nester that shows up in California most years in the Central Valley, but doesn't usually come into the Bay Area very strongly. So the Swainson's hawk closest to me migrates by the millions down to Argentina every year, and the entire species passes through Panama, along the Panama Isthmus, before moving into the Cordillera of Colombia and down into the middle of Argentina. So the migrations on some of these birds are fabulous, spectacular, and at the same time I would tell you probably there's red-shouldered hawks in Belmont that never leave Belmont. So it's an amazing range of possibility. Those are the soaring hawks. These are the accipiters, the forest hawks, that tend to dwell in forests in California. We see many, many sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks. Like Pennsylvania, we don't see many goshawks there up in the High Sierra. The falcons are the fast-flying falk birds with big, sharp wingtips, and 4 species of falcons that we see. What I call L-dubs, large, dark, unidentified birds, are the 2 eagles and the turkey vulture. And then some outliers, really 3 outliers. Osprey or fish eagles, harriers and kites are mousers from the grasslands of California, especially in the coastal and Central Valley areas. So these are our 19 different species. These are the birds that may be migrating right down the spine of Belmont in the fall and in the springtime. In fact, this is peak of spring migration right now. So the Raptor Observatory was formed in the 80s, partly to emulate what had been done by the Bruins in Hawk Mountain, Pennsylvania back in the 30s, and to get people excited about raptor migration, come up and see the raptors every year with your family and see birds close up that we've banded. It's also to count the hawks, just like Maurice Brune did. We keep track of the hawks going by, and this is the one piece of count data I'll show you. Down there at the bottom, we started in 1992, run to 2012. You can see that the peregrine falcon trend is up, which is actually fabulous because we know after DDT was taken out of the wild that this was our chance to see a species bounce back from extinction. We did a great job on the conservation biology of peregrines, and today we know that the trend was upward all over the western United States. There were 2 nesting pairs, by the way, in the state of California, 1970. Most recently, we're around 400 pairs in the state, and about 25 in the Bay Area alone. We also trap and band birds in order to put bracelets on their legs and see where they move. Bracelets are not very effective at tracking birds, meaning that we happenstance get a recovery rate of about 3%. So we band 30 hawks, we hear of 1. That's our band recovery map for recoveries from 40,000 birds banded. This is about probably 1,200 in this particular map. And you can see that what we're doing is defining the raptor migration animal on the Pacific coast. And a lot of it is squeezed west of the Sierra Nevada. A little bit topples over into eastern Oregon, eastern Washington. It goes as far as about British Columbia to the Queen Charlottes, and it goes south into a little bit of the central part of Mexico. But it's largely a Pacific coast migration. Our raptors like the coastline. They're adapted to coastal travel in coastal areas. There's a lot to say about this, but what I thought I would do is finish the talk by breaking down to a few stories of red-tailed hawks we've now put satellite transmitters on. That's the newest thing. Your iPhone, you can strap it to the back of a hawk, it turns out, and it gets its own solar battery flowing, and it can read GPS signs for where it is for whatever frequency you program it for. So that's a cell phone style. And what it does is it collects GPS information, and then when it passes near a cell phone tower, it automatically downloads from the hawk to the cell phone tower, from the cell phone tower back to my computer. So it's a pretty efficient system, and it only costs a few $1,000s, which is a lot less expensive than chasing hawks around. So I want to show you 2 hawks. Here's a red-tailed hawk, and each of these red hawks is 12 hours apart from the one before it and the one after it. And it's hard to count them all up because there's so darn many. But this is a red-tailed hawk that was banded in August of 2012, left the Marin Headlands, made a little jog out to Angel Island, and then went south toward Belmont. Went down to Belmont, but look at that pack of dots, rock dots in the South Bay. What's going on down there in my yellow area? Well, of course, we wanted to see that closely. Turns out that's the Stanford Hills. That's right up there near Slack. Actually, where I grew up playing on my Stingray bike back there in the Jasper Ridge area. And you can see that there are some hot spots, but what really intrigued me is the red hot spot, because that's not in the hills. That's in the middle of Palo Alto. What is a hawk doing with all of those contact points in the middle of Palo Alto? Well, it turned out this hawk had found the one vacant lot off of Arastradero Road near the corner of El Camino in the middle of Palo Alto. It was a relict orchard that was barely an acre big, surrounded by cyclone fencing with razor wire at the top, and there were so many ground squirrels in that. They were vibrating, the ground was vibrating. And this bird found this spot. And the reason I love this is this bird stayed there for about 2 or 3 months during the winter of 2012, 2013. This is a red-tailed hawk wildlife refuge for one bird to survive the winter. And here it is in the middle of Palo Alto. It could be anywhere in the bay, right? But it's in the middle of Palo Alto, and it shows us clearly what a raptor needs to make it through the winter. One raptor, one winter. First year of life, it's the hardest time. Raptors have about a 70% chance of dying in that first year. So this is a tremendously exciting bit of information to get. I actually got out of my car right next to the street. She flew over me. I could see her transmitter, and she was carrying a ground squirrel, and I thought, this is a happy bird. The next bird I want to tell you about was 2 years later, and this is a bird that did something very, very different. Also a red-tailed hawk, also a young red-tailed hawk. This bird flew first 7 days. There's about its 3rd or 4th day. Again, the dots are 12 12 hours apart from each other. So one is a noon dot, and the next hawk is a midnight dot. So we can figure out where the hawks were roosting. This bird made it down to the Salton Sea in about 5.5 days. So the first week to the Salton Sea. This was so exciting to us. This bird was reading the migration manual. It will go south for the fall, and it trucked south. And then what happened? Look at the second week. The second week, it completely turned tail, went up the east side of the Sierra, circumnavigated the entire Sierra Nevada, and ended up in eastern Oregon 2 weeks later. What the heck is going on with this bird? It gets more weird than that. So the 4th through 7th week, it stayed in a 10 square mile area out near Klamath Falls. Klamath Falls is a really rich area for wintering raptors, and I'll tell you what I think the story is in a little bit. Here's weeks 8 to 19, moving into January. It comes down to the Central Valley, stays in the Central Valley. So now it's absolutely surrounded the Sierra Nevada, and it hasn't made it net movement south yet. I'll just finish this off quickly. There's February, 1-day trip down to the Bay Area, and then a week's trip back up, and then back to the same spot in the Central Valley. So what is this starting to tell us? It starts to tell us that these raptors have places like this one near Yuba City. I love this. Where March and April of 2015, this bird stayed in a tiny, small area of the Central Valley, and we went close to see what was going on so we could track it. And it turned out there was a sleeping place, and there were 2 eating places. It's a restaurant and a hotel. 2 restaurants and a hotel. And this bird was so perfectly contained in the Central Valley and had just the life that it needed to survive the winter. So big picture, we have something like this. The bird looks like it's drawn a fish here in the middle of California, but it does say a few things about raptor migration, especially with red tails. It can be very adaptable depending on where the food is. And I think those spots where the bird stayed contained for a while, it had stumbled probably onto a ground squirrel haven that was going to make it survive through the wintertime. So ground squirrels, mouse outbreaks, prey outbreaks, raptors have been breeding for 30 million years they've been on the planet. 30 million years they've been migrating, and 30 million years they've been figuring out how to find outbreaks of prey. By the way, one of the great outbreaks of prey that occurs most winters is the wave crest area next to Half Moon Bay is a tremendous spot for raptors to occur. In many spots around the county that raptors can occur like that. So this was the classic view of the migration. Birds go south in the fall. This is what we know now. And yes, we did have a peregrine go out to the Farallones, so that western arrow is true. Raptors really take a lot of different directions depending on the species, depending on their prey and their habitat preferences, and they really need to be looked at one by one individually. These are some of the questions in the second 30 years of the GGRO that we have more refined questions now. We know the hawks aren't all going south, and we know that they respond to many parts of human culture and human population growth, and that's a big part of what we're going to be looking at in the next few decades for the rest of my career. Before we end, the supervisor asked me to speak a little bit to what we can do for migrating raptors, and I thought the easy thing is to say don't use rat poison. And rat poison is truly one of the most unbelievably available and easy to purchase ecocides that we've ever handed to the public. And we're right now in a lot of campaigns to maneuver it off public store shelves so that my 17-year-old daughter can't buy it in 50-pound buckets and put it anywhere she wants. And she wouldn't, but, just to get the point across. So we're not going to talk about decon. I'm going to talk about, I think, what the bigger picture stories are, what really takes care of animals on a broad scale. And the first thing I'm going to say is value flora and fauna. I think the most important thing I've learned in 30 years of doing this is that we don't, as adults, role model a deep love of natural history and ecology and our natural areas. We're good at role modeling love of Super Bowls and rock stars and things like that. We don't role model a behavior for our children that's something about deep love of nature, the kind of stuff that allows nature to be valued on a broad scale. We don't communicate when we buy things about our deep love for nature. It somehow usually comes free in many ways, and we don't press for it, either as voters or as purchasers. We don't pay attention to land use decisions. We usually relegate that to the Sierra Club or the Audubon Society or the county supervisors or people in certain positions who are smarter than we are or know more. We got to get past that. We've got to get past that these places we value are places that are worth fighting for. Two more and then I'll close up. I'm shocked being a parent of teenagers in Berkeley, California, how little ecology and natural history they've learned. They go to science class, they get the STEM stuff, but STEM has mostly completely ignored where you live and the importance of native animals and native systems, ecological systems, the stuff I learned as an undergraduate from Art Shapiro, how incredibly important it is to think of these intact systems that have been around for millions of years and know a lot more than we do about what should be going on there. And we're so naive about the systems and all the details. And the details of these native systems are incredibly beautiful. I'm going to say they're more beautiful than art. They are art. They're where art comes from. Be a person of place. This is huge for this county. This county has a huge influx of new people all the time. New young people who don't know yet what this place is all about. And we need to do better as mostly elders in this room to teach people what it's like to be in San Mateo County. What San Mateo County means as a place, as a location, as a place of culture that's been lived in for millions of years. So something to think about. I want to run one last picture with you because I just found this. Rachel Carson, before she died in 1964 of cancer, was invited by none other than the Kaiser Foundation to speak at a conference on human health and the environment. 1963, that's my first amazing thing. And the second thing is I managed to find a photo from the Chronicle that was online of her sitting, standing at the podium. She was too weak at that point. She was in a wheelchair, she was barely 100 pounds. She got wheeled up to that little table before the audience came in. She actually had no hair, that's a wig she's wearing because of the radiation treatments she'd been using for about 2 years at that point. And the reason she came to the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco was because before she died, she wanted to see coast redwoods. So she made the trip to California. David Brower, then head of the Sierra Club, took her on a day-long trip the next day to see the redwoods in Muir Woods and to see the beauty that we in the coastal zones of California sometimes take for granted. She traveled the country in order to see this, in order to transmit her information, speak about what Silent Spring had taught her, but also to see something that was of such deep, deep value and importance to her. So I just wanted to finish off with that. Thank you so much, Supervisor and staff, Susie, for having me here today, and I hope we didn't talk too long. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a question?
Yeah.
What are the diets of a raptor?
What are the diets of raptors? You know, the best thing to think about related to the 19 species that I showed you is some are incredible generalists. They'll go to sushi bars today and a taqueria tomorrow. And might say a red-tailed hawk might be specializing on snakes during a certain season and ground squirrels another. And if they can catch birds, they'll go after birds. Some of the other species here are incredibly tightly defined and specialized into a certain kind of prey. A good example is the white-tailed kite, which is 95% mouser. It is the better mousetrap, and its location in the planet is defined where outbreaks of mice occur that are appropriate for that. So with a lot of ecological species, we worry about the species that are more specialized because we, of course, can mess it up for them more quickly. But one of the interesting things about this community of raptor species is many of them respond to similar kinds of prey and can take advantage of certain rodent outbreaks or bird outbreaks or even insects. One of my favorites is that Swainson's hawk that travels down to Argentina. When it gets to Argentina, it mostly eats grasshoppers. By the way, Angela, is Angela here?
Yes.
Yeah, you're a grasshopper person.
I am.
I am so interested in talking to you. She's here today as a monarch person, but anyway.
No one has ever said that to me.
Well, so one of the really exciting things in the bird world is we are seeing a lot of our grasshopper eaters disappear. Swainson's hawks, large grassland birds that would normally be eating up the locust explosions of the West. We're not seeing locust explosions anymore. We're controlling them really well. And as a result, the raptors that rely on them, which includes some pretty large-sized hawks, are being lost as well. So it's an interesting problem.
What causes these rodent outbreaks that you're talking about?
Ooh, we might have rodent migration or something. You know what, I can't really speak to that, and I can think of 3 or 4 people I would call, but I'm sure it's some perfect storm of weather conditions and grass seed availability. Art, do you have any thoughts on that? What causes an explosion of rodents?
Oh, there's a huge literature in the subject, but it's basically a multifactorial thing. But in the Arctic and subarctic, they tend to be cyclic with a periodicity of about 11 years. They're a lot more irregular down here.
That's great. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah.
So San Mateo County has a lot of open space. Could maybe some tracts of land in there be changed over to be hawk feeders? I mean,
Well,
enhanced for, raptors or something like that?
The open spaces here, I don't think you have to do anything.
Okay.
And maybe the best thing to do is create monitoring systems that involve people going out. You have an awesome Audubon chapter here. Sequoia Audubon does a lot of really good work and important work. But bringing more of a broad community out to see those raptors and look for those birds and be invested in. There's an interesting thing, an annual striped bass index that shows up for San Francisco Bay, and I always think, wouldn't you love to turn on the television in the morning and know what the annual monarch index is or what the annual raptor index is? There's so many people doing such good work. It's actually a matter of just bringing it out in the public light a little bit.
Yeah.
But protecting the land you've got protected is, of course, one of the great achievements right there. But then knowing what's there and keeping track of it is the second part. Back to Rhythm.
First, just to respond to your one slide about the rat poison,
Yeah.
I urge everyone in the room to take a look at a bill that's in Sacramento right now, AB 1788, Richard Bloom. It's to ban all use of second-generation anticoagulant and pesticides in the state. So please.
I'll pay you later. Thank you. Yeah, and we're getting good leverage on it right now too.
Just
Yeah.
go through its first committee. Also, recently there was, in the paper, I saw that there was an outbreak of Newcastle disease in
Yeah.
the city. Does that have an impact on the populations or stuff?
We don't know yet. I should say, I don't know yet. I'll cop to it. I don't know yet. I'm in contact with some Davis colleagues who are Newcastle experts and wondering what it might look like and how we might perceive it. One of the interesting things about the migration and through the mid-headlands is we have, for instance, during the West Nile virus episodes, we took blood from about 100 raptors to see the West Nile virus increase in the numbers of birds. We thought we were just going to lose birds. In the Midwest, they lost owls, they lost corvids. In Chicago, we were worried we would lose numbers of birds. We don't seem to have, but we did find that with red-shouldered hawks, particularly, they had up to 15% antibodies, high antibodies for West Nile virus, which is interesting because it means they could survive it. And they can build up antibodies. And so we are very interested in diseases. Newcastle is definitely on my horizon right now. Yeah, right here you have a question.
Yeah, so I live on the coast, and along Highway 1, it always seems like there's certain raptors along the
Yeah.
coast. And they seem like they're always there all year round.
Yeah.
I'm curious if, when they migrate, do they come back to the same
Yeah.
spot? And are
Yeah.
they booted out by another bird, or is it?
On a little scale, yeah, they do a lot of that, but raptors, a species, seems to have a pretty, well, first of all, there's a name for it, which is really lovely. It's called philopatry, love of place, philopatry. And a lot of animals have some kind of philopatry going on. They go back to the same wintering territory. A friend of mine who studies raptors in the Central Valley says he knows he can go to a particular corner of this road and that road near Grizzly Island, and there's always a frugivorous hawk in that hole. And what I love about that is he said, and the really interesting thing is, every year it's a juvenile plumaged bird. So it's not one bird that's just coming back to the same pole. It's a habitat, microhabitat that says, ferruginous hawks, land here, please. You know, it's somehow speaking to something in the bird that brings it back to that micro location. And then you think, what if you take that micro location and you turn it into a Kohl's department store? What happens to that hawk? Well, obviously the hawk doesn't fall over and die, but for sure there's got to be more mechanisms for the hawk to get place number 2 or place number 312, or that there's something going on. But there's a really beautiful process, and you described it really well. I do the same thing. You drive down certain stretches of highway, you know there's going to be a red-shouldered there and a kite there, and it's neat that we are so hawk-tuned that we can actually tell that and know that there's something going on there. We don't really know how it works, but it's neat that it's going on. How am I doing in time?
You have one last question.
I have one question. Anybody? I've exhausted you.
I have a question about that. I got engaged on Hawk Mountain.
You did? Are you still good? It's still good? Okay, good. Good. I've officiated a wedding up there. It was, and mine's still going too, so that's really exciting. Well, actually, my last message would be, come this fall and see what we're doing. Come visit us. Don't come on a weekend. But I'll tell you, the biggest concern I have right now for the hawks in the headlands is the GGNRA lands are getting loved to death, and weekends in the headlands, to get from the beach to 101 some Sunday afternoons takes 3 hours. It's about a 4-mile stretch, but there are so many people. We're at a point where we need, Muir Woods is doing this already, we need to start saying limiting access. And that's not why these urban parks were set up. They were set up for the people and to be open and to be free, but we're really, we're going through some interesting, important, thoughtful times where we have to wonder how that's going to be. And Belmont's, in many ways, our open lands in Belmont and in the mid-peninsula are going to be similar questions about when do we love a land to death, and what does that look like. So thank you again. I'm going to pass this on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fish. Gosh, that was wonderful. I'm going to have to dig out my copy of Rachel Carson's book and reread it to get this raptor chapter. But anyway, thank you again. Our next speaker is Dr. Jim Harvey. He has taught at the Moss Landing Marine Laboratory since 1989. His research interests include the ecology and morphology and behavior of marine animals, marine mammals, birds, and turtles. He's currently studying a long list, the feeding ecology of California's sea lions and Pacific harbor seals. So please welcome Dr. Harvey.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us. There it goes. So I'm a marine scientist, and so instead of birds that don't like to be over water, I'm going to talk about animals that love to be over water, or in it. So I do a lot of work on birds, mammals, and turtles, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit of stories about migration associated with those and how that impacts, or what kind of impacts are happening with those animals. And I'll start with this slide for a little bit of time here, and we'll sit on this one because I want to show you sort of what's going on. So obviously, we got a picture here of the globe with North America in the central spot, and we're in this area, of course, and there are a variety of different animals migrating through or to this location all the time, at least the large marine vertebrates. These include blue whales that are coming, breeding down in the southern part of the Pacific and coming up into the California region, humpback whales that are breeding down here in off Central America and Mexico and coming up into our area, gray whales that are eating up in Alaska and then migrating down the coastline past us to Baja. They're doing that on a regional basis. Albatrosses that are breeding in the Hawaiian Islands and then flying over to California to forage. Leatherback turtles that are breeding in Indonesia and then swimming across the Pacific and foraging off of our coastline. Sooty shearwaters that are breeding in New Zealand and Chile and then migrating each year up to spend their time in the summertime off California. So a large number of animals spending a lot of time and energy moving to get to this place. So you live here, they like to visit and spend time here. So I'm going to talk about a number of different animals. Gray whales up here in the upper left, albatross to the left here, leatherback turtles on the bottom left, fulmars, which are the birds that are up here, humpback whales, and blue whales. So I'm going to just tell you stories about them. So why do these animals migrate? Obviously the story of today is just talking about migrations. For us, talking about large vertebrates, there's a number of reasons why animals probably migrate, but the central one is the one that's the bulleted thing right there, which is the optimum place to reproduce is not the optimum place to eat. So the idea here is that winter breeding is usually held in places that have benign environments, that is warmer temperature, whereas the place to eat, which is summer and autumn, is usually in areas that have high productivity. So this is a map of the world's oceans, color coded productivity. So primary productivity, a higher productivity is in areas where there's yellow or red, and lower productivity is where it's dark blue. And you can see really rapidly that the lowest productivities is in the central parts of the oceans. There isn't a lot of productivity happening in Guam or wherever. When you're out there in the middle of the oceans, there's not a lot of nutrients associated with the oceans to allow it to be productive areas. Whereas all the areas that are light colored, especially the reds, are areas that have high productivity. I mean, you can see that most of that is in high regions of the high latitudes, here in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere, and then along the coastlines. Along the coastline, especially on the western sides of the continents, you get high productivity, and we are in one of those spots. In California, we're along a western boundary current, which with winds and a bunch of other things will generate very high productivity along our coastline, which is what attracts the animals to this location, because there's a lot of food associated with it. So if you're an animal that wants to reproduce in warm water, you want to go to these areas, but you'll notice that these areas don't have high productivity. So when you want to eat, you want to go up to the north or to the south of those locations. So most migrations end up being north-south in the marine world. The whales, the birds that I'm talking about, oftentimes are breeding in the north or south. I mean, in the tropical areas, warmer water, and then moving to locations north or south that have higher productivity. So most migrations for the turtles, birds, and mammals are north and south. There are exceptions, though. Albatrosses, for instance, as I mentioned, are breeding. Some of the albatrosses we're seeing here off our coast breed in Hawaii and then fly across to the east. Now, I'll stop and tell that little story because it's kind of interesting. So we have two major albatrosses that we see off of our coast, often black-footed albatrosses and Laysan albatross that nest in the Hawaiian Islands. Those animals have a chick, fly to California, feed for 2 to 3 days, make an oil that has high concentrations of nutrients, fly back and feed their chick. And so the male and female are going back and forth. So the chick is sitting there on the nest waiting for a day or two. Mom flies in, regurgitates this food items, the oil for the chick. The chick eats that. Mom sits there around there for probably half a day, flies away. 2 days later, father comes in, lands, regurgitates the oil to the chick. The chick feeds. So it takes a long time to feed a chick, or get a chick to full stage when you're only feeding it every other day, 2 days, and your parents are traveling from home on the Hawaiian Islands to the grocery store, which is in California, and doing that back and forth. Amazing kind of adaptations to make use of the fact that, again, the Hawaiian Islands are in an area that's really unproductive. California is in an area that's very productive. That's the reason why they're migrating. They're migrating because the food is in a different place than the best place to reproduce. So how do they navigate? So these animals are going great distances, as I talked about. How do they figure out how to get there? And here's all the list of ways that they are able to navigate and orient. One is using a sun compass, where they need to know the position of the sun and have an internal clock. And hopefully you can do this sort of yourself too. You can look at the sun and go, oh, the sun's right up at its peak, must be noon. So you can get a pretty good feel for what time it is of the day, and you can get an idea where you are on the Earth by knowing what the sun compass looks like. They also use a magnetic compass. So the Earth has a magnetic field around it that looks something like this, whereby if you're at the poles, the magnetic field is at 90 degrees to the surface of the Earth, and when you're at the equator, the magnetic field is parallel to the Earth. So based on the inclination of the magnetic field, the birds especially, and other animals using magnetic senses can tell themselves where they are on the face of the Earth based on, or latitudinally anyway, based on the magnetic field. So they're using the magnetic compass also. They also use a star compass, assuming you can see the stars. If you're a gray whale, you're probably not looking at the stars very much because your eyes are under the water. But the birds certainly use a star compass. And that compass is developed very early in age, and only if they can see the starry night. So as the animals are developing, if they can see the starry night, they can start to develop a star compass capability, and they develop that mostly as juveniles, and they'll develop. And then there are a number of other possible things that they use as ways to navigate, including the moon, polarized light, wind, infrasounds, and sense and landmarks. So let me tell you a couple stories about a number of the animals that I study. The first one is the sooty shearwater. So this is a bird about the size of a medium-sized, smaller gull. Here's a sooty shearwater in my grad student's hands. Here's a picture of a sooty shearwater on the wing, flying. And this is a map of satellite or tagged sooty shearwaters that were tagged by Scott Schaefer, a colleague of mine, who tagged these birds down in New Zealand. So the yellow and blue colors are different birds moving around during the breeding season down in New Zealand. So these are birds that are nesting in New Zealand. And you can see them going out and foraging and bringing the food back to their chick all around this area. And then some birds fly to the east, but most of them take off and fly up and into the North Pacific during the summertime. So about May or so, they take off, come up north, and some portion of the birds spend their summertime on the Western Pacific, some of them spend their time on the Eastern Pacific, and so we have a large number of birds that are spending their summer off of California, or and I'll show you a picture here in a second of how they're using the California current system. And then after they're done here in fall, they head back to New Zealand. So on an annual basis, these birds are going between New Zealand and California. Sooty shearwaters are the most numerous seabird we have off of our coastline during the summertime. So if you've ever sat off the coast here and watched a huge flock of black birds flying around out in the ocean, that's just who they are. These are sooty shearwaters. Hitchcock did a movie called Birds. That, even though they used crows, I think, some sort of corvid in the movie, we really believe it was sooty shearwaters that was actually the birds that were a part of that phenomenon that actually occurred that he wrote the movie about. And we think it was Demoic acid that was probably causing the problem for the birds at that time that made them crazy and flying into the house and everything else. That was the basis of that movie. So sooty shearwaters are the birds. So if you want to have a nightmare, this is the birds to use. So here's an example of what that looks like. So my lab, my office is right there. This is a flock of sooty shearwaters in Monterey Bay about 3 years ago. You can see flocks of up to 100,000 sooty shearwaters at any given time along the coastline. So it's a very abundant, like I said, a very abundant bird off the California coastline. We've done a lot of satellite tagging on these birds. Here's a sooty shearwater with a little satellite tag on its back. And this map, and it's a little hard to see, But the reddish colors are the high concentrations of where the birds are during the summertime. And you'll notice that from about Southern California up through to our region is very important areas for sooty shearwaters to be foraging. So it's an important bird along our coastline, migrating from the southern hemisphere up to here each summertime. And this is what they're coming for. This is shearwater food, anchovies, juvenile rockfish, market squid, euphausids or krill, and sardines are the main food that sooty shearwaters are eating. And you're gonna see this over and over again as I talk, that this group of fish or prey is the primary food for most of the animals I'm talking about that are coming here to eat. Here's another example I just mentioned of that bird that is coming from Hawaii to our coastline. So Dan Anderson tagged birds in the Hawaiian Islands, and this is the tracks or different locations of birds throughout that time, showing their movements from the Hawaiian Islands to California and the North America, and then back again, doing that every 5 to 7 days. So 5 to 7 days to get from Hawaii to California and back again. So like I said, mom and dad are going back and forth, feeding their chick. Here's the little chick. There's mom or dad. Hard to tell the males and females apart. But amazing birds. Some of the satellite tags have indicated that they can get from Hawaiian Islands to California with never touching the water, so they're on the wing the entire time. And there are periods of a day to a day and a half where they never flap their wings once. So they're using the wind to propel themselves. So very efficient flyers and very capable of going long distances without a lot of effort. So that's a good example, I think, of two birds that are doing long distance flight. They have a lot of advantages being a bird. They're lightweight, they can use the wind, and they can go for long distances without a lot of energy. But the next couple animals I'm going to talk about are animals that are much bigger, and they have to swim through the water, and the water's dense and thick, and they're big. So now we're talking about animals that are probably spending quite a bit of energy to get where they're going. So you may not know this, but leatherback turtles exist off your coastline. This is what a leatherback turtle looks like in the ocean. There's the head. Here's the big head on the left-hand side. Here's a turtle we've caught, so you can sort of get a sense of how big they are. The biggest turtle we've caught was about 1,800 pounds. So they get to be large turtles. And as I mentioned, these guys are mostly breeding in Indonesia. So they're spending their time off in Indonesia nesting, the females going up on the beach and nesting, the males mating with the females. And once they're done breeding, some portion of the leatherback turtles forage on the western Pacific, but some portion of them actually swim across the Pacific to our coastline. Takes them about a year to get across the Pacific to our coast. Once they're there, they'll forage, and I'll show you a picture here in a second of what they're foraging on. Then they'll go off of they're foraging off California during the summer fall when it's warmest and the prey are there. Then they'll go off Hawaii during the winter time. Then they'll go back to California, and they'll just do this 3 or 4 times, going back and forth between our coastline out to Hawaii during the winter to be in warm water during winter, and then back to our coast. And they go back and forth for about 3 or 4 years until they get big and fat enough to then swim all the way back across a year later back over to Indonesia and nest. So, and this is just a little young hatchling about yay big size as it leaving the nest and going back into the water. And this is what the leatherbacks are coming for. They eat jellyfish. This is one of the weird things that we've been trying to understand recently. The jellyfishes that they eat include this purple striped jellyfish, moon jellies, but the primary one that they go for is this sea nettles jellyfish. And if you look down, this is a leatherback, that's my hand right there. This is a leatherback's mouth being opened up, and you can see all these little pointy things in the throat. Well, those pointy things are pointing backwards into the mouth, and that's to keep the jellyfish going that way down the mouth and not come back out. So once the leatherback's got a jellyfish in its mouth, it's a one-way street for the jellyfish. Jellyfish is going into the stomach because of this incredible array of projections in the throat to keep the jellyfish going the right way. So that's what they're coming here for, is jellyfish. And here's a picture just to show you some years past of our aerial surveys to find out where where leatherbacks are. So each of these dots is a different leatherback turtle in different years. You'll notice that you're right in here, and this is the highest concentration of leatherback turtles along the western side of the North America is off San Mateo. So if you want to go see leatherbacks, you won't see them because they're there, but hardly anybody. It's really difficult to see them. We use an airplane to sight them so that we can go and catch them and put satellite tags on them. I was talking to a fisherman in Monterey Bay a couple of years ago. He'd been fishing in Monterey Bay for 35 years. And I said, how many leatherback turtles have you ever seen? He goes, they don't live here. I go, yeah, they do. They go, no, I've fished for 35 years, I've never seen a turtle. So I take up this picture and I show it to him, and there's a leatherback turtle in the picture, and the stacks at Moss Landing are in the background, so there's clearly that it was in Monterey Bay. He looks at me and goes, I don't believe you. Anyway, the bottom line is it's true. Their leatherbacks are off here, and like I said, right there is the big concentration. You have the best place for leatherbacks in the North American coastline is right here. And this is what they're looking like when they're foraging on a jellyfish. And this is, I always caution when I bring videos, some of them work, some of them don't, so I usually don't put them in, but this is shots of a camera that we have on the back of a turtle. This is the head of the turtle coming up to a jellyfish, and you can see it coming in and consuming the jellyfish. So the big question for us was jellyfish, as you might know, are about 95%, 98% water. So how does an animal get that big eating water? And so we didn't know. For years and years we tagged animals and watched them swim around. We understood the depths they were going to, but we didn't, until we put a camera on the turtles, did we finally recognize what was going on. And what's happening is the turtles are coming up to eat the jellyfish from the bottom, so they eat as they come to the surface. So they go down to depth, and then as they start swimming upwards, they start eating jellyfish as they come to the surface. So they're always eating from the bottom up. And what they end up doing is only eating the bottom part of the jellyfish, which is where the stomach and the gonads are, which is all the nutrients. So they disregard all the other stuff that is water and don't eat it. They only eat a part of the jellyfish, the part that's the good stuff. It's like taking the Oreo and breaking it open and eating only the good stuff in the middle. So that's the answer to the question of how does a leatherback get so big eating jellyfish is you only eat the good stuff. You don't eat the whole thing. So incredible animals, as I said, and mostly we're talking about, they arrive June, July off of our coastline and are here until August, September, and then they're back out. So that's leatherback turtles. Gray whales, another good example of animals migrating. A series of different pictures of different gray whales. Here's a juvenile little gray whale. This is a foraging gray whale. These guys are animals that breed up in Alaska, or eat up in Alaska on benthic prey, and then come along the coastline all the way down to spend their winter time in the Baja lagoons, and then turn around and migrate back. And so I put on here the timing of them. So heading south, they're coming around Cape Sarachef in November, December, going north through there in April and June. So we see animals off of our coastline here heading south in December through February, and then the whales, once they've bred down here in Baja, are coming back up through our area February through May. So we are now in the northward migration of gray whales coming along our coastline, and they're moving into the time frame where most of the animals coming through are going to start to be females with calves. So here's a progression of different animals heading north and south. They go in a certain order, and right now the females with calves are the ones that are heading northward. So that's gray whales. This is humpback whales. Again, I'll remind you, humpback whales are breeding down in areas off Mexico and off Central America. And after they've bred there during the summer, the winter time, then they head up and move into Northern California. And they're kind of a weird, interesting animal in the sense that the animals that are really south, very far off Central America, they end up going a shorter distance and coming off our coastline. The animals that are off Mexico breeding go farther north and feed up off Northern California, Oregon, Washington. So there's two distinct, genetically different humpback whale groups off California. If you were off San Francisco Bay or wherever, this area, during early spring, you'd probably see these animals, Mexico animals, heading by you. And then now, as it gets into sort of the summertime, a little later on, and the animals you see feeding off of our coastline are the animals that were breeding farther south. So there's two different distinct humpback whale groups that are coming through our area, with the southern animals, the ones that feed off of our coastline, and the ones off Mexico that are going past us to the north. And then I'm going to stop by talking a little bit about blue whales. So blue whales, biggest animals in the ocean. My dad was a botanist at San Jose State, studied, did a lot of marshline restoration here in San Francisco Bay, but he also was an expert on giant sequoias. And he used to love to tell stories that he studied the largest living thing on land, and his son, he studied the largest living things in the ocean. So I don't know what he instilled in me, but we like big things, I guess. So here's a picture of a blue whale underwater, large animal. But the interesting thing about blue whales is they eat krill, but they eat lots of krill. So to do this, here's krill. That's not a full-size krill. That's obviously magnified. The krill is only about an inch long. So each individual is an inch long, and you eat a lot of those things, and you get to be 85, 90 feet long. This is a picture of Monterey Bay. We're us doing some acoustic work. This is a patch of krill, is that big red area. And the cool thing about krill is that they vertically migrate. So they spend their nighttime at the surface feeding, and then because of predators, they are forced down in the water column during the daytime. So they dive to about 250 meters depth or so during the nighttime or daytime. And it's at that time that they concentrate in big, thick groups like this, and that makes it perfect for blue whales to be able to take them. So we've done a lot of work with tagging blue whales. This is me with the pole right here. That's actually a humpback whale, and this is a humpback whale because I don't have a really good picture of a blue whale tagging, but that's truly a blue whale. So we come up next to them on a boat, put a pole with a suction cup, attach a tag onto the back of the animal, and because of that, we can now tell you where they're feeding, what they're feeding on. And recently we've come to realize that humpback whales, like I said, feed on these patches of krill at 250 meters where they go down and then lunge through the krill patch as they're feeding on those krill. And so they obviously eat lots and lots of krill to be able to do that. And here's an image of that happening. Here, the yellow is the blue whale diving into the krill patch, which is the red. A number of lunges up through the krill patch, and then back up to the surface, breath, back down to the krill patch. So, and here's that satellite tagged animals, just to show you blue whales' movement. So they're breeding off Central America, and then coming up off of our coastline and moving up and down the coastline throughout the year, feeding on a variety of different krill patches. So I'm going to end by just talking about what kind of changes have happened in migrations. One of the big things for these large animals is that with climate change, the landscape that they live in is changing. And one of them is ice cover, for instance, just to give you an example. Ice cover in the Arctic is declining. That gives the gray whales, for instance, a lot more time to feed on prey. And that leads to a decrease or a delay in the migration of gray whales along our coastline because of climate changes now already affecting gray whale migrations and the timing. just as an aside, just because it affected me, was that impact allowed 3 young gray whales to make a mistake years ago, where 3 gray whales got caught in the ice in Barrow, Alaska, because they were spending too much time foraging and didn't get around the corner of Barrow and back down in time for the migration, and the ice came in and caught them, and they made a movie about that, that thing called Big Miracle, if you ever saw that. I was one of the biologists, so John Krasinski, or what's his name? Krasinski, who's this guy? He played part of what I did in that movie. So I spent 6 weeks up in Barrow trying to save the 2 gray whales that were in the ice there. So I like to think that climate change affected me because I had to migrate to Barrow to help them try to get these whales out of there. As I said, San Mateo County is one of the largest concentration of leatherbacks off of our coast, and we still don't know how climate change is going to impact the animals off our coastline, other than it's probably going to impact their prey, and we know it's affecting their reproduction. So here are all the list of things I know that's going to happen migration-wise, changes in migration for these animals I just described, with changes in ocean temperature, ice, and the prey abundance and distribution is definitely going to change. And then lastly, things that you can do. One of them is, there's not a lot you can do for whales and large birds oftentimes. They've got their own things that they're doing, and us on land don't really impact too much what they do, other than a few things, like plastics. Obviously, plastics are a huge thing. This is a picture of a fulmar, and it's hard to see right now, but almost all those particles you can see in his stomach, those are plastic. So about 85% of the fulmars that we examine have plastic in their stomach. And the problem with plastic is it doesn't degrade, it makes the bird feel like it's still full, so it doesn't eat as much, and it'll kill it eventually because it's not eating enough food. So that's certainly one thing you can do, is avoid plastics. Another is, for whales, is avoid close encounters with them. They're migrating through areas, and they like to migrate unimpeded without having boats and stuff in their way. Ship strikes is a big deal for blue whales right now. So we've had a lot of recent killings of blue whales and fin whales because of the container ships moving so rapidly through the water that they're hitting whales. And we're trying to get the boats to slow down, and we're also trying to change their path as they come into San Francisco Bay, so that they're not moving right through where the humpbacks are foraging. And then you can support any kind of efforts to reduce bycatch and maintain the prey populations that we have. Just to give you an example of what's happening recently is, this is a picture off La Jolla. This black area is not an oil spill, that's an anchovy school. School's anchovies. And what's happened recently with some of the environmental changes that have been occurring is that the anchovy schools are moving closer to the shoreline, and so the whales that feed on these are moving closer to the shoreline, which means they're getting impacted more and more by vessel traffic because they're feeding closer to where humans are going. And then the big thing for me, as far as helping these animals, would be reducing your carbon footprint. Obviously, we know with climate change, it's a huge issue. You have no idea what's coming. We don't know what's coming, but we know it's not good. The projections on what's going to happen to the oceans with climate change are just scary, really scary. And that's it.
Questions?
You answered part of my question. I live in Half Moon Bay, and I've lived over there for 40 years. During the last 5 or so, we see the whales much closer to the coast. I mean, we used to have to go out to see them. Now we can sit there and just watch them. And then the other thing is, there seems to be more of them, and they linger more than they used to.
Yes, so I'll give you an example. My office, you saw, I had that picture of the sooty shearwater, large swarm of birds in front of it, and then in the background was a building. That's Moss Landing Relab's main building. So my office looks out over the bay, and 3 years ago I watched about 60 to 70 humpback whales feeding within 600 yards of the beach out my window for about 3 to 4 months. about 60 animals. My favorite story about that is I'm sitting in my office on a conference call, and I got my phone on, and I'm watching the whales. And it just happened at one time that all the whales surfaced at the same time. So I said, holy crap. I didn't say crap. I used a different word. But I go, oh, holy crap, and then I stopped, and all of a sudden everybody stops on the phone conversation, and they go, Jim, are you okay? And I go, yeah, no, I'm okay. And then I go, no, what's happening? And I go, it's all right, let's keep going. And they go, oh, no, we really want to know. And I go, okay, well, I'm sitting here and 60 whales just surfaced in front of me, and then you hear all this moaning, because probably half of the people are sitting there looking at a parking lot or something. And I'm looking out at whales. So what's happened is some of the environmental conditions have changed. The anchovies especially have moved much closer to shore, and therefore the whales and stuff are moving much closer to shore. And there's these hot spots of where those anchovies are going. Monterey Bay is one of them, but off Half Moon Bay and here is another. And so you're seeing those animals not only closer to shore, but longer time. Yeah. And we don't know whether that's going to change, but right now, yeah, for the last 3 to 5 years, that's been the pattern. Yeah.
So you said the black-footed albatross may not flap its wings for a day or a day and a half. Are they sleeping while they're gliding?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know, probably a little bit. This is an aside thing, just to show you how animals work, and I don't know that birds do this, but you know that your brain is split in half to some extent, so your left side of your brain controls your right eye, for instance, and your right side of your brain controls your left eye. Well, dolphins use that to sleep. So in a school of dolphins, for instance, the animal on the left-hand side of the dolphin school, their left eye is looking out and surveying what's going on, and their right eye is asleep. So their left brain is asleep, as their right eye kind of doesn't have to be functioning, because they're protecting the school by looking out to the left. And so they'll switch their brain left and right, sleeping or resting. But I don't know about birds. I don't know what's going on with the birds, whether they're able to do that. But yeah, we've got good evidence that as long as the wind's blowing strong enough, they can maintain flight, and going forward, they call it dynamic soaring. So basically, if the wind's coming from this direction, the birds can actually fly into the wind with never flapping their wings by grabbing the wind, going really fast, and then coming down really close to the ocean where the wind speed is much less, and going forward and just going this.
So just to follow up, so they've got a lot harder time going from the east to the west because they're going against the wind.
Yeah, we don't have as much in that area. The wind is not as strong as like the trade winds when you get down closer to the equator, where the winds are really strongly moving from east to west. So yeah, it depends on if the wind stops. It's not very efficient for shearwaters or albatrosses to fly when they don't have wind. So if the wind dies down completely, they just drop to the water and just sit there, and they'll wait till the wind comes back up. So yeah, they've got to kind of be cognizant of when the wind's blowing, and it's got to be blowing. It doesn't really matter which direction the wind's blowing from. They can move with it or against it. Yeah.
When you describe an environment as benign, what do you really mean by that?
Well, by benign, for the young ones, that means, so females are looking for areas that are warmer temperatures, calmer, and less predators. That's what I meant by benign. Even though these are big animals and you'd think they'd be okay in the water, they're still marine, or they're still mammals, and so their internal body temperature for a whale is the same as ours. So whales have the same internal body temperature as we do. So if I threw you in the water right now, the way you're dressed, do you have any idea how long if I threw you out in the ocean, offshore here, how long you'd last before you'd be done? Got a guess of how? No, a little longer, usually. You can last probably about 45 minutes to an hour and a half. Especially if you curl yourself up and kind of like that. Well, of course, whales are in that their whole life. So they've got all kinds of adaptations to maintain their body temperature. But when you're a little baby born, your blubber thickness is very thin, and so you don't have the mechanism to retain heat as well. So being in warmer water is really important for them, and that's what I meant by benign, warmer.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
Go back to the albatross. Have you folks overlay weather maps? Because in the summertime, the North Pacific High moves up and down. And do they follow a particular contour?
They do, yes. Yeah, they'll move around. There's a really good map that I have on the Sooty Shearwater, just to give you an example, not using the albatross, but the shearwater as an example. We had tagged about 15 Sooty shearwaters here along this coastline with satellite tagged and tracked them as they flew back to New Zealand, which takes them about 7 to 10 days to get from here to New Zealand. All of the birds we are tracking pretty much were in a straight line to New Zealand. And remember, the Earth is turning below them, so they still know which direction to go, regardless if the Earth's turning and everything else. But there was one bird, so all of them, almost all of the birds that we were tracking were individually, they were not all in one flock, were going down. And then one bird went like this, around like that. I mean, we were puzzled. That bird had left the area about a week and a half later than all the other birds. So we went back and looked at all of the environmental conditions, and sure enough, there was this big storm, and this bird just basically went around the storm. So yes, they'll use, depending on what the weather, where the high is and the wind patterns, they'll shift their migration paths. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. That was really terrific. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Lindley. He's interested in how the physical environment influences the dynamics of aquatic populations and communities. Recent work has been on Chinook salmon, steelhead, and green sturgeon in systems ranging from small coastal watersheds to the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Lindley, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for coming out. I hope you're enjoying these talks as much as I am learning about new things. I'm going to talk to you about fish migrations in the California current, but I will mention at the end of Women's History Month that a little fact I learned just this week was that Rachel Carson was the first female to be hired as a research scientist for the U.S. Bureau of Marine Fisheries, which is the predecessor of the organization I work for, NOAA Fisheries, so cool connection there. An inspiration to many of us, I think, in the room. So I'm going to be talking about the action that goes on under the water off the coast here, which is a lot harder to observe from the beach. The California current, which is the ecosystem off the shores of San Mateo County in California more broadly, has been called the Blue Serengeti because of the intense migrations of predatory animals that come there to feed on the herbivores that aggregate into the seasonal bursts of productivity. And I'm going to be talking about salmon, in particular, a painting of one there on the left by Ray Troll, which are foraging on sardines and anchovies and juvenile rockfish, along with things like yellowfin tuna, skipjack tuna, bluefin tuna, swordfish, and albacore. And those are all scary predators if you're a small fish, but there are actually truly terrifying things, equivalent of lions, which are the great white sharks, which also migrate seasonally to the coast here. People have known about fish migrations for millennia, probably well before history was recorded, but Aristotle himself wrote in 350 BC about the migrations of bluefin tuna in the Mediterranean, which were really remarkably well understood. There were important fisheries there that were exploited by the Phoenicians, and this is a picture from a Greek urn of some fellows getting ready to butcher a bluefin tuna. And these are fish that live much of their lives in the North Atlantic Ocean, but do migrate into the Mediterranean seasonally for reproduction, and they come quite close to shore under certain conditions, and people have been attuned to that and able to go out and capture these enormous marine fish when they appear. Aristotle, he had a lot of things right there, but some of them were very confusing to think about how he came up with that. He recognized that the bluefin would be unavailable to the fishermen in the Mediterranean in the wintertime, and he thought they buried themselves in the mud. I don't know where they got that idea, other than they disappeared. In fact, they would be out in the ocean, potentially off of Canada. Not a lot of progress was made understanding fish migrations for a few thousand years until the early 1900s, when the dawn of modern fisheries science really began. And some people in Norway were fighting over what was going on with cod fisheries there. And these fisheries were focused on small fjords along the Norwegian and Finland coast, and they would fish for cod there. And the cod were going away, and it was thought at that time that the cod were basically born in the fjord and lived their whole lives and reproduced there. And when you fish all the cod out of your fjord, you'd have no more cod. And the way to solve that would be to have cod hatcheries and put the cod back into the ocean there, into these fjords. But some other scientists there thought that was probably not right, and through careful studies of the fluctuations of the cod populations along the coast, and some of the first tagging studies, they documented, in fact, that the cod were part of a much larger population, and there were some important movements that happened, migrations. And these will be pretty familiar from what you've heard about mammals and turtles and birds, but with a little bit of a twist that fish have, because they live in the ocean their whole life, and they evolved there, and they, unlike, say, a whale, which is born at a pretty impressive size, they get quite a bit larger, but fish are born almost microscopically small, a lot of species. They're very, very tiny, and they grow many, many orders of magnitude over their lifetime. So they have the conditions they need when they're a tiny juvenile versus an adult are very, very different, and it's rare to find those things in the same place in the ocean. And also a bit of a different thing about many fish, especially at temperate and higher latitudes, is that their feeding happens in the summer and they have to survive in the winter, and that can be a stressful period for them, like for, I guess, really a lot of animals, but we heard about that with hawks as well. And what came out of the Norwegian studies was this idea of the migration triangle, which is depicted here. It's not the most exciting looking cartoon, but the idea is that there's a nursery area, which is where the fish need to be to survive from their egg stage, which can be very, very tiny, till they become larger, where they might eventually recruit to become part of the adult stock. And they also have a spawning area. And where a bird lays its egg in a nest and the baby bird can grow up there, the fish are putting their eggs typically just in the water, and the water is moving all the time, kind of slowly compared to the wind, but ocean currents are important. So if you want your fish to end up in this nursery area, you need to account for that if you're a fish by laying them somewhere upstream, and the eggs will then be delivered through ocean currents. And then there'll be this movement into the adult stock, and then movements from the spawning areas to where they're feeding there. And these are related to ocean currents typically. And this pattern, I should say, a really important part for fish to be able to do this is this idea of phallopatry, which we heard about, which is being able to return to the area where you were born to lay your eggs, or in the place upstream of that, where that would be successful. And how fish can do that in the oceans is kind of an amazing, somewhat mysterious thing still. The spawning, the migration triangle can be elaborated and in detail for any particular fish. It often is a bit more complicated than that. This is a picture here showing one triangle for adults and another one for the immature fish. And oftentimes these things will be separated in space and time. Why that is somewhat of a matter of speculation, but fish do often segregate their habitats as they grow, and this does suppress cannibalism, which they are prone to do otherwise. And you can look at this in a third way, thinking about this happening over time, and you can break it up into seasons, so you might think of this as latitude and longitude, and there's a certain area in space here where the spawning might habitat, and then dispersal to the nursery area, which may be somewhere different, and then further movements to these feeding and wintering habitats. And some animals will go off to other places and they'll show up there, but they don't really complete this migration cycle. Those are called vagrants. I think bird people call them that as well. This is an important thing because sometimes these things work out for them and they can establish new migration triangles through these kind of exploratory or even accidental movements. And then they'll come back together again to reproduce. So this is advantageous because it makes it easy to find your mates if you all go to the same place, and you can overwhelm the predators that may be following you there because they'll become full, with the exception of people who've developed ships with freezers and industrial capabilities. And when fishermen can find something like this, they can go to town on it. And this is why, when I was a kid, orange roughy was a popular fish in the market. You don't really see that anymore. Orange roughy or fish lives off of New Zealand and they get really old, but they take a long time to mature, and they aggregate over seamounts where they spawn, and people figured that out, and basically they caught all the orange roughy. It was more like coal mining than farming. And so orange roughy were heavily hit by that. So that was a kind of a general picture of fish migration and why fish have to do these migration circuits typically in the ocean. The California current poses some special opportunities and challenges for fish. And Jim alluded to, or talked a bit about what's going on in the California current, but I thought I would tell you a little bit more about that. So this is a subarctic current that comes from off the coast of Canada, from the Arctic Pacific. It runs along our coast here, and it's partly why it's so disappointing to go swimming on San Mateo County beaches in the summertime, because it's Arctic water coming down here. And in the summertime, this is further aggravated by the prevailing northwest winds, which blow up your beachhead in the afternoon, that drive this process of coastal upwelling, which creates an inshore, very strong current. And because of the Earth being a rotating sphere, the water is deflected away from the coast, and it's replaced by this cold, nutrient-rich water, which fuels phytoplankton and zooplankton, which form the murky green water you'll typically see in the summertime here. And that's great food and fuel for the anchovies and the sardines, the juvenile rockfish that flourish when this is working well, and it attracts all kinds of other predators to feed on them and to feed on the things all the way up this food chain to white sharks, for example. So great feeding ground. That's why so many things are coming to the Blue Serengeti. It's a terrible place to try to make to do your reproduction for fish. You need special adaptations for living here. Some fish basically try to avoid this by brooding their young in their bodies, giving birth live, and taking advantage of different tricks to keep their larvae from getting out into this current. Because if you go out here, you're just going to be sent down to the tropical Pacific, and that's no good. You're never going to be able to get back. And if the wind is really strong during the upwelling season, you can be blown offshore. So fish need to deal with that, and I'm going to talk about. Oh, first, I'll tell you, how do you know about fish migrations? Because as the fisheries scientist John Shepard noted, there's a lot of similarities between forest management and fisheries management. Same kind of math and principles apply, except that unlike trees, fish are invisible and they move around. And you can't see them other than maybe the white shark if you're unlucky surfing out at San Gregorio or somewhere. Mostly it's all under the surface and very difficult to observe. So people have developed tagging systems to do this. And a lot of these are used really for the basis of fisheries management right now. And I work a lot on salmon, and one of the main tagging systems there is something called the coded wire tag. These are tiny little magnetized pieces of wire that have a laser code number etched on them. You can batch mark salmon by the millions with these. They're really quite small. They can be very young fish. And those can be released, and then you can recover fish in fisheries, and you can find out that they have this tag and take it back to the lab and read it, and then you know where that fish was recovered. Similarly, large visible tags are used for various similar purposes, for particularly smaller studies, where there'll be a phone number to call for a reward or whatnot if you catch one of these things. So if you ever are out fishing and you find a fish with something like this, just look for the number. You might make some money, and some fisheries scientists will be really happy to hear from you. We have also been benefiting from the microelectronics revolution, and there are similar cell phone-based technologies that are applied to fish. These are still a little large for salmon, although we do a little bit with these. These are about the size of a small flashlight, and they can communicate with satellites when they're at the surface of the ocean. So you have to tag the fish and let it go for months or up to a year. And these things can record the depth, the temperature, and they have a little light sensor on there. And through with a clock and knowing the time of sunrise and sunset, you can calculate your latitude and longitude from that. And you can then get these kinds of tracks that Jim was showing about the continuous motions of fish in the environment. And unfortunately, these are $3,000 to $5,000 a piece. They only work about half the time. An intermediate technology, and this is widely used for salmon, are acoustic pingers. These are about maybe the size of a vitamin pill, or about that size. They can be implanted in young salmon about that long or even a little shorter. And they emit a series of coded pings that you can listen to with hydrophones. And if you're clever where you put those hydrophones, you can follow the migrations of fish that way as well. In addition to these human technologies, you can take advantage of of biology to track fish, and this is how some of the early information was learned as well. So fish, you might be alarmed to learn if you like eating them and don't cook them a lot, are full of all kinds of parasites, weird little worms and whatnot. And it turns out that fish that live in different places have different characteristic parasites with those. And when you can learn about that, you can then look at areas where fish are mixing together and whatnot and figure out where they have come from. And that's a whole business unto itself in fisheries management. And another thing that's cool about fish is they have something called an otolith. It's an ear stone, and it's a small bone in their head, and it accretes like a tree ring over time. And it creates these bands so you can tell how old a fish is, just like you can tell how old a tree was when you cut it down. But even cooler than that, it records the chemical signature of the waters that the fish are in, and it acts like a flight recorder, essentially, for the fish. And if you know about the chemical environments that the fish might be traveling through, you can use advanced chemistry techniques to probe these little bones and figure out the movements of fish from that way. And this is a whitefish from the lake that is influenced by mine tailings, where there's a lot of zinc, and then it goes into this lake, and you see these patterns of undulation. Basically, this fish is moving back and forth between some habitats there. And this has been used to track salmon as well, to figure out where in, for example, the Sacramento Valley that they were rearing before they went to the sea. So now I'll tell you a little bit about salmon migration. This is a picture of a number of species in a fish ladder somewhere, and the big one in the middle there is a Chinook, which is the most common one that you would encounter if you were out on a fishing boat off of Half Moon Bay in the summertime. And everybody knows, probably since kindergarten, about the basics of the salmon life cycle, that they're born in fresh water. They're famous for their ability to home to their natal stream. They're probably the poster child for this idea of philopatry. And as they grow, they move down the stream and they spend time in the ocean, and then they return and they start to mature to the river, and they complete this cycle. And that's a very simplistic view of what's going on, and it does imply migration from freshwater to the ocean and back, but it's really much more complicated. This is kind of illustrated by this neat poster that Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada produced. It might be a little hard to see, but I'll guide you through it. So this just shows that the juvenile fish here, which are the product of these adults, that they die after they spawn. You probably learned that in kindergarten as well, another famous thing about salmon. They have to migrate through a river that they've never seen, into an estuary where they've never been, and there are threats all the way along here, different things trying to eat them and whatnot. And then out into the ocean, where they do undertake characteristic migratory circuits through what's almost always a novel environment, really, until they're an adult and they make this return migration back to the place where they were born. So how do they do that? It is a really remarkable thing. And they use a variety of techniques, and this will be a little bit familiar, I think, from what Jim showed about the mammals and turtles. They use very similar cues. So this is a nicer cartoon that shows how fish that were in the ocean to get back into these estuaries. Well, all these principles apply for salmon, which are doing kind of the reverse. So in the river, it's kind of easy to figure out where the ocean is, right? The water is running to the ocean, and you can just use what's called rheotaxis, the direction of the flow, to get you to the ocean. In fact, you don't really have to do anything. You just have to kind of give up and drift downstream, and you'll get to the ocean, and that actually does happen. And fish tend to head downstream backwards, tail first, and they move a lot at night when they, possibly because they lose visual contact with the stream bed, and they just start drifting. When they get to the estuary, things get a lot more confusing, especially in a place like San Francisco Bay, where the tides are much, much stronger than the river flow. So now, following the flow will just lead you around in circles. And they do a fair bit of that as well. But they can take advantage of the physics in the estuary, which is there's a flow going out along the surface of fresh water, and a return flow of salt water up the bottom, and then a tidal cycle that means that when the tide is falling, there'll be a strong flow going out to sea. And the fish somehow can figure out the tide phase. It's not really known how they do this. So when the tide is flooding in, they may move to the bottom of the estuary or to the side where there's no current, and when the tide reverses, they move out into the flow. And this will ratchet you out of an estuary into the ocean if you do that. And they definitely do this behavior. Once they get into the ocean, then it's really up to them to start swimming around, and salmon are of the size to be able to do that by the time they get there. And they use the similar cues to what Jim was talking about here, that they have, they can do celestial navigation and solar navigation. They can track the polarization of the light, and they also can use the magnetic field of the Earth in a couple different ways to figure out where to go. And an exciting new paper that came out just I think a year or so ago showed that salmon are actually born with a map of the Earth. It's a very primitive map, and it's based on the idea that, and Jim talked about this, that there's the strength of the magnetic field does vary with latitude. So it's high at the poles and lower at low latitudes. And this very clever experiment was done where they took salmon, raised at, they were born in a particular place, so they evolved to live here for the Pacific salmon and an Atlantic salmon here in Canada. And they put them in an experimental tank with a camera to watch where they go and which way they're pointing. And they surrounded this with these coils where they could manipulate the strength of the magnetic field. And they found that when the fish were in a magnetic field like that where they evolved, where they're born, that they basically orient sort of east-west. And when you move them to a stronger magnetic field, they start pointing south. And when you move them to the weak magnetic field, they start pointing north. So the fish essentially knows about its latitude from the strength of the magnetic field, and they're born with this map, which is really cool. They also have a compass. This has been known for longer. It comes from these really clever experiments of sockeye lakes in Canada. So there are many lakes in Canada and Alaska, Washington State, that hold sockeye. And sockeye are a little bit different than Chinook salmon and other kinds of Pacific salmon, in that they like to rear as young juveniles in lakes. And lakes typically, natural lakes, will have a stream going into them and a stream going out of them. In California, we usually put a dam on that stream going out, which is why partly we don't really have sockeye salmon here anymore. So if you're born in an inlet or an outlet stream, you need to know which way to swim to get to the lake. And they found that ones here born in the Cedar River, which goes from south to north, will swim to the north to get into this lake. And the Chilco, which is the stream comes in here, they swim to the south. And similarly, Weaver Creek, they swim to the north. And these kinds of adaptations that have been coded into the genome by evolution are really fascinating and powerful, but also a bit of a problem when you're trying to restore sockeye salmon, because it's hard to get this right. And in fact, sockeye have almost never been successfully reintroduced after they've been extirpated from river systems. All right, so this is a figure. I was a little reluctant to show you guys this because this is pretty hardcore fisheries science, just published by some of my colleagues in the Canadian Journal, which is basically what we know about the ocean migrations of Chinook salmon right now, based on those codewire tags I showed you. And there are fish hatcheries all along the coast from central California to southern Alaska that are releasing these fish with the codewire tags. And there are all kinds of fisheries along the coast that are recovering them, recreational, commercial harvest of a variety of kinds. And they're the first ones to systematically analyze that with very rigorous statistical methods to come up with this picture of how salmon are distributed along the coast and how that shifts over the time. And I'll try to walk you through this. So the bar colors have to do with the origin from these regions from north to south of where the salmon were released. And these are landing, reporting areas where the fisheries are landed. So we see this pattern. Essentially, the fish migrate out from where they're born along the coast for some distance, but not everywhere. So they're locally distributed somewhat around their place of origin. And this shifts seasonally. So you can kind of see a little bit, if you look carefully, you have to look at this pretty carefully. But in the springtime, they're fairly spread out along the coast. And in the summer, they start to contract until in the fall, they appear more concentrated around their area of origin because they're maturing, some of them, and they're coming back to spawn there. It's a little bit disappointing that after 40 years of codewire tag studies, this is really about all we know about what salmon are doing in the ocean, kind of spreading out and contracting along the coast. And it's partly because we don't have but we're still finding out new things about this. So there was just a big survey, you may have heard about it in the news, where a Russian ship took a bunch of North American salmon scientists out to the winter to the North Pacific to find out what salmon do in the winter, because no one's fishing for them there, partly because they're spread out and the conditions are horrible for fishing. And they caught coho salmon in the open subarctic Pacific. Coho salmon were thought, on the basis of codified tag recoveries, to be distributed like this, just near shore along the coast. So this is a brand new discovery. Nobody knew coho salmon did that. We have a lot to learn. I think when the tags get maybe the size of a little tiny flashlight, we're going to find out really cool things. Okay, one other thing I wanted to tell you about is that these general patterns of migration they hold true, but within populations, and Alan talked about this as well, there are animals that do things differently. And I'll tell you about something to do with migration timing, and then about what we call partial migration. And we're finding out about the genetic control of this, which is something I wouldn't have thought we would really be able to do in my lifetime. But with the advent of human genomics technology, we're actually finding out that we knew these kinds of things were heritable, but it's remarkable how simple it turns out to be in a way. So this is a picture of people fishing on the Columbia River for Chinook salmon, and there's a kind called the spring Chinook that you catch in the springtime, and they're still silver bright like they've come in the ocean. This is what they look like if you catch one off Half Moon Bay in the summertime. And they migrate into the river in the spring, and they penetrate far into the interior of, even into Idaho, probably into Canada before dams were built there. And they can access then these nursery habitats that are at high elevations that would be unavailable to fish moving in the summer or fall when flows are lower. And this is what's called a Thule Chinook. So this is the same species, caught in the same part of the river, but later in the year. This is a fully mature male Chinook salmon. It has all of its secondary sexual characteristics developed here, and it's changed from silver to this kind of olive and red color. It almost looks like a different species. I think people probably used to think that they were. It turns out that the difference that controls whether they migrate in the spring or in the fall is one tiny segment of the entire genome, and this is found through analysis of basically genome sequencing and then looking at genetic differences between these kinds of populations. And then this is, I don't really have time to go into detail on this, a tiny section of the genome that is completely different in the ones that migrate early and late, and it totally controls their migrations. So there's some data. Oh, I didn't want to do that. This is looking at fish coming into the Klamath River, where they can collect them just as they enter the river from the ocean. And early in the season, they have this genotype, which we call premature migrating. And they're all homozygous, so they have the same copy of each part of the chromosome from the mom and the dad that make them migrate early. The ones that come in late have this mature migrating genotype, and they're also homozygous. And then in between, they're intermediate, a little bit more like the early migrators. And there's basically almost no overlap between the early and the late when they're homozygous. And this is, to me, it's really remarkable because one of the best studied genetic phenomena is human height. So we know that if we're tall, our parents were probably tall. If we're short, our parents are short. There's some variation there. There are hundreds of genes involved in that simple trait. And here we have one gene that controls this thing about whether you come back in the spring as a silver bright fish or this reddish green thing later in the fall. A similar thing that we found out, the genetics of it are a bit different, are this phenomenon with steelhead. So steelhead are these ocean-going rainbow trout that get quite large, and they're in San Mateo County. You can go out and see them right now if you know where to look. And the streams around here will have the steelhead, but they'll also have resident trout, which are these little guys here. They live in the stream their whole life. They are not migratory. They might live 7 or 8 years, and they interbreed with these big ones. And if you would think about why would that be, you would think that one tactic or the other would be better, and that evolution would drive one of these things extinct locally, and the other one would dominate. And that is seen in some parts of the range of the species. But in Central California, we find that these non-migratory forms are coexisting and interbreeding with the migratory ones. So how can that be? The morphology is totally different, the behavior is totally different. These guys undertake extensive re-migrations. They go to the subarctic Pacific for several years, and then they come back to the stream to reproduce with these little guys. And This is also can be explained by a single genetic marker, and it has a simple Mendelian inheritance like Mendel's peas. But it's actually, we found out through genome sequencing, it's what's called a supergene. So there's actually maybe 100 genes involved in this behavioral difference, but they're all together on one part of a chromosome, which is flipped end to end between these two different forms. So why you're a mixture of your mom and your dad is not just because you're half one and half the other, otherwise you'd look identical to your siblings, but there's this recombination of the DNA over much of the genome that makes you a little different than your brother or your sister. But areas that are inverted like this don't recombine, and you can then maintain and have evolution operating separately on these different segments of the genome. And we showed here that this totally controls whether the fish, not totally, but largely whether they migrate from the stream. So we can tag juvenile steelhead in a little creek with these pit tags, which is, they're like the radio frequency ID technology like your fast pass, except they don't have batteries, so they're not as powerful. And they swim through these little antennas that you can construct with a data recorder, and you basically get a timestamp of when the fish pass by. And when you release fish with this anadromous genotype, they're highly likely to be seen downstream at this antenna. And if they have the resident genotype, they're not. And what's really cool about this result is these are the females, which their fecundity, their reproductive capacity is really tied to their size, because they lay fairly large eggs, and the bigger they are, the more eggs they lay, and the more reproductive success they have. So it's advantageous for them to go to the ocean and get big. The males are about equally as effective whether they're little or not, right? They make way more than enough milk to fertilize all the eggs. So there's this sexual dependence of the effect of this genotype on the fish, so that the males, even when they have the anadromous genotype, are less likely to migrate, and the heterozygotes, so the ones that have a copy of each, are more like the resident form than the anadromous one, like the females. And this is a way that you can then maintain this phenotypic diversity within a population without evolution driving it to one extreme or the other. Okay. We were also asked to say a little bit about threats to migration. And salmon migration, people have a lot to do with whether it works or not, and a lot of it's pretty obvious. So we build a lot of roads, and we put culverts under the roads, and we often don't do a very good job of outlining those with the stream bed, and it's really hard for salmon to get up through culverts. There are millions of these in North America. A lot of effort goes into pulling them out, making free-spanning bridges so that the salmon can migrate up there. Another obvious thing are these impassable dams. They're the basis of our water storage conveyance system. Salmon get up to the bottom of those, and they don't go any further than that. There are cases, like this is the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River, where there's a fish ladder that lets them up there. And that's good, and these have gotten a lot better. But other predators figure out that the salmon end up kind of stacking up at the bottom of these and milling around there. And California sea lions go all the way from California up to the Bonneville Dam to eat the salmon there, and they eat a large fraction of some of these threatened endangered runs that people are spending millions of dollars to recover, and they just go to town on them. Another more subtle thing is having to do with how we operate hydro systems. Has to do with water quality. This is a famous picture from the Klamath River near the beach in 2002. You may recall there was a big fight, this was during the Bush administration, about releasing water from Klamath Lake for irrigation or for fish flows. They went with irrigation, and there were a bunch of Chinook salmon came into the lower river there, and it was really hot because the flows were low, and there was a disease outbreak, and a lot of dead fish. 3 years later, the fishery was a disaster because these things couldn't reproduce. Some lesser threats that are kind of emerging that I'm interested in have to do with energy, ocean energy development. So we did a study off the coast of Oregon to look at how this might impact green sturgeon, which is a species I studied. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to tell you anything really about them, that migrate between Central California and Canada, and even as far as Alaska, right along the coast. And the idea with wave energy development is to put these buoys offshore that ride up and down with the waves and generate electricity. There'd be big arrays of them. And then they have a cable that would run from the wave array to the shore. And when you run electricity through a cable, there's probably electrical engineers in here that can explain this better than me, given that we're in San Mateo County. When you have an electrical current going through salt water that's flowing due to the California current along here, it generates electromagnetic fields. And when you have a magnet map in your head and a compass in your head, that could probably be a little bewildering to encounter that. So we worry about these disrupting fish migrations. And another thing that I'm interested in, I actually did an interview with Fox News once, which was kind of a terrifying thing on camera. Because they brought me in to basically explain what idiots the people were that were thinking about harnessing tidal energy. This is San Francisco here, and Marin, the Golden Gate. There's an enormous amount of energy. Anybody who's been in a small boat on a tide out there knows this. It rips through like 5 or 6 miles per hour at the surface. And the idea would be, it has some nice features, to put these turbines along the bottom that would harvest this energy as the water sloshes in and out of San Francisco Bay, which is great, except that there's hundreds of thousands of migratory fish that go in and out of this thing. Salmon, obviously, steelhead, a couple species of sturgeon, shad, striped bass, California halibut, and the engineers think probably the fish won't get hit by these, but I've seen dead sturgeon floating around that have been chopped up by tanker ships. They're not very smart about getting out of the way of that. I mean, they evolved in nature, not in our modern society. So they're not necessarily equipped for these things. I'm reluctant to bag on wave energy and tidal energy, however, because it is a major solution to global climate change. And climate change is a major threat to salmon, especially to their nursery habitats. And we need to get a handle on this if we want to see steelhead in San Mateo County. On a positive note, animal migrations are an important adaptation to be able to cope with a changing climate. They are all the time exploring environments and finding new places where their life can work for them, and they can establish new migration circuits that will allow these species to persist so that there will be Chinook salmon for a long time. But whether they're off in Monterey Bay in the future is more of an open question. We're already seeing them getting into the Arctic Ocean and exploiting new streams where they have not been for 100,000 years probably. I think with that, I'll end and take any questions.
I know this is a big question. Can you say something about the relationship between hatcheries and wild species that's happening to the gene diversity and their survival?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a highly controversial subject as well. So if you go fishing off the coast here and you catch a salmon, look for the fins on the back. There's one called the adipose fin. It's a fatty little lumpy fin towards the tail. And those will be cut off of 25% or more of hatchery fish. The last 3 salmon I caught didn't have those fins. And overall, a typical year, 80 or 90% of the fish that you would catch here would have been born in a hatchery. And this is important for commercial and recreational fishermen who bear the brunt of droughts and the development of our water system, and these hatcheries were built to mitigate that. On the other hand, you've created an artificial rearing system that can lead to domestication of the animals. So they can start adapting and evolving to conditions in the hatchery. And our agency has published reports on this, offering best practices to try to minimize the impact of this unnatural selection and maximize natural selection so that we can maintain wild fish while still mitigating these other environmental impacts and having hatchery fish. But there's a huge tension there. The fishermen, especially the commercial ones, 10 years out doesn't mean anything to them. They can't go 10 years without fishing. So they like more hatchery fish. They also like to have them moved in trucks down from where they're born and say up around Redding into San Francisco Bay. This does disrupt the migration of fish because one of the things I didn't really mention actually, another mode of navigation that salmon uses is olfaction. So smell and taste of the water. They can imprint when they're babies and use, if they can remember somehow these smells as they migrate down, and they use that to retrace their steps. If you put them in a truck and then put them in the bay, it cuts that connection, and when they come back, they go everywhere. So they might find their way to San Francisco Bay, but they go in all the different rivers, and it's such a problem recently, when they've done more of this to mitigate the drought, that there's not enough fish to even get back to the hatchery for the hatchery to get enough eggs to keep going. So it's a problem, lots of trade-offs.
Thank you, Dr.
All right, thank you.
I want to do a quick follow-up on a couple of things that Dr. Harvey said when he asked us to, we need to reduce more carbon. Those of you who are Peninsula Clean Energy customers, that is a big reduction of carbon by having PCE. And Rick DeGoya, who's on the board, is with us today from the town of Atherton. Thank you for that work, Rick. The other thing he mentioned was plastic bags, and my colleague Supervisor Slocum and I have been banning pieces of plastic bag for a number of years, and I think we'll probably have to take a look and see what we can do more. We'll go back to work on that. So I just wanted to give you that follow-up on. We are doing some of the things that our speakers have asked us to do. Our next speaker, Dr. Arthur Shapiro. And this is interesting, because by the 5th grade, he had narrowed his focus to insects. And while in junior high school, he read Evolution, the Modern Synthesis by Julian Huxley, and he became hooked. So he received his PhD in entomology from Cornell University, and while attending the National Science Foundation Summer Institute, he was encouraged to apply for a position in the zoology department at UC Davis. He's there now, and he located to Davis in 1971-72. And please welcome Dr. Shapiro.
Okay, folks, well, unlike our other presenters, except our last one, Angela, the migrations I'm going to talk about are ones that have been going right by you in the last couple of weeks. How many of you have seen the painted ladies? Okay, I went outside to look and see if there were any right outside here, so I could allude to them, but there aren't any. And we are wondering whether there will be any more, but that will come up in a couple of minutes. Okay. One of our respected national newspapers, not terribly long ago, had an article about the decline of the monarch butterfly and referred to it as unique, the only insect in the world that migrates seasonally like birds. Well, that's utter total nonsense. The world is full of thousands of species of insects that migrate seasonally. And I'm going to tell you about some of them around here that are not monarchs, although they are often confused with monarchs. With the current painted lady outbreak, you would not believe, or perhaps you will, the number of messages I am getting from people saying, it's a miracle. The monarch was almost extinct and now there are millions of them in Riverside. Not all orange and black butterflies are monarchs. Okay, if you look very carefully at that picture, go back to it for a minute. You might see a few specks in the sky. That's a still from a video of a migration of California tortoiseshells over the summit of Mount Lassen a couple of years ago. We estimated that there were 500,000 butterflies that passed over the summit of Mount Lassen. Okay, now we can move on to the animal in question. Monarchs aren't the only butterflies that migrate, far from it. These are California tortoiseshells. Now, I made up a handout. Have they been distributed? Because most people are not familiar with painted ladies and tortoiseshells, these are just printed versions of, of the appropriate pages from my website, so you can read them at your leisure and learn more about the two major migratory non-monarch butterflies in California. Okay, California tortoiseshells. As it says here, California tortoiseshells hibernate as adults in foothill canyons. They come out in late winter They mate and they're breeding right now. By this time of year, the butterflies look really ratty, like the one in this picture, because they hatched last July. Now, as you'll learn in a minute, the life cycle of the tortoiseshell and its seasonal migrations have evolved to match the availability of host plants. How many of you know the genus Ceanothus, called wild lilacs? A very large, important genus of shrubs, mainly but not exclusively of chaparral. The California tortoiseshell feeds on nothing but Ceanothus, and its life cycle is pegged to the availability of young, tender foliage of Ceanothus. Like most woody plants in California, except riparian species whose roots have ready access to the water table. Ceanothus put on all their growth for the year in the first few weeks of the season, when you have a combination of warm temperatures and available moisture. Ceanothus foliage is defended against herbivores and pathogens by tannins. You're all familiar with tanning leather. The point of tanning leather is to protect the leather against bacterial and fungal attack. So tannins are protective chemicals. At budburst time, when Ceanothus begins growing, the leaves are readily edible and have little or no tannin. As they mature, they become more and more tannin-rich and less edible or digestible. So the butterfly has to lay its eggs right at budburst time on a particular species of Ceanothus for the caterpillars to be able to begin feeding before the leaves become indigestible. So the whole life cycle is related to that. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, here's a view of typical tortoiseshell breeding habitat in the foothills. Ceanothus is one of the dominant shrubs, but not the exclusive one. During big tortoiseshell years, in mid to late spring, every leaf on foothill Ceanothus will be consumed by the caterpillars. They then pupate on the bare stems of the defoliated plants, and the pupa hangs upside down, as you see in that picture at the side. I might mention that some Native American groups ate the pupae and harvested them for their own food. The pupae may still be in that stage when it gets hot. And one of the funniest things you can see in the California foothills, and maybe some of you have had the experience, is a leafless plant of Ceanothus with 1,000 tortoiseshell pupae fanning themselves to keep cool by jerking back and forth like this. All of them jerking simultaneously. If you ever encounter it, videotape it, because people are always astonished to see it. Okay, forward. Okay. The eggs that are laid now will become butterflies in May. The butterflies typically come out when California buckeye trees are in bloom, and that's a major nectar source. So in a big butterfly year, every buckeye tree will have dozens or even hundreds of tortoiseshells feeding on it. They nectar for a few days. They also harvest other resources. There's a group of them feeding on what we think is mountain lion scab. We think of butterflies as very delicate in their tastes. They're not. Okay, next. Okay, those butterflies, it's now late May, fly up to the high country where the snow is just melting off and the high elevation species of Ceanothus are undergoing bud burst. So they're timed to synchronize with that, to exploit it. This sometimes produces a very bizarre situation, like back in, I think it was 1983, which was another very big snow year like this year. The torties arrived at Mount Shasta when the upper reaches of the mountain still had several feet of snow. But at the base, tobacco brush, the plant on the left there, was already undergoing bud burst. So they dumped all their eggs on the plants that had melted out of the snow and were beginning to grow. The snow line kept retreating up the mountain, but all the eggs were dumped at the base, with the result that in a few weeks, every leaf of tobacco brush at the base of the mountain had been consumed. The ground was covered with starving caterpillars wandering around desperately looking for something to eat. And if they had just gone 300 feet up the mountain, every leaf was there. Okay, so it's a crapshoot. Your migration is supposed to coincide with the availability of host plants. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The adults regularly visit monardella, coyote mint, or mountain pennyroyal, one of their favorite plants. Okay, well, by the time that brood emerges, it's late July. The ones that have fed on tobacco brush and other high elevation ceanothus. And there's nowhere to go to breed anymore because there are no higher elevation species that are going to melt out and leaf out that late in the season. So what the butterflies do, oh, I should mention this. Summer breeding is in a different place every year. We don't find caterpillars in the same place year after year after year. We don't know how they decide where to go, but it probably is a very effective strategy for avoiding predators and parasites. Some years they leave the state completely, and they breed in the summer in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. But the resulting butterflies always come out in late July to early August next. Okay, the numbers may vary by 5 to 6 orders of magnitude. So some years, like during the entire drought, we had virtually no tortoiseshells in California. They came back very strongly after the drought ended. Next. Oh, okay. I'll just finish about torties very quickly. That picture from Mount Lassen shows what they do at the end of the breeding season. In early August, they migrate to above tree line. Again, the locations vary, but often it's in the high Sierra south of Lake Tahoe. And you can get aggregations of hundreds of thousands or even millions of them that just hang out. We call it estivation. It's the summer equivalent of hibernation. Doing nothing except conserving energy for the rest of the season. Every time we have a big torty year, I get messages from people that run like follows. I was hiking on the John Muir Trail, and I was above tree line, and I found myself transported to heaven. Everything was covered with a sea of monarch butterflies. Okay, they're not monarchs, they're torties. And those torties, come September, will one by one leave the summits and fly down to the foothill canyons to hibernate to breed next March. Okay? Okay, that's the tortie story. Now, painted ladies are what's been coming through right now. Torties are regional migrants. Painted ladies are global migrants. Okay, they have much more spectacular migration skills than monarchs in many ways. The ones that you've been seeing originated in the deserts of Southern California. The seasonal migration cycle is the same every year, regardless of population size. But when there are only a few of them, like last year, nobody notices them. When there are hundreds of millions of them, everybody notices them, like this year. The biggest year ever, as far as we know, because there are no quantitative records before I came to California, was in 2005. Now, if you remember 2005, it wasn't an El Nino year, but it set records for rainfall in the desert. and it had a huge super bloom, even bigger than this year. And that's the key to this phenomenon. All the painted ladies in North America go down to the US-Mexico border in the fall and hang out in the deserts from West Texas to Baja. They move around looking for places where it's been raining in the winter and there's a bloom. Their eggs are laid on desert annual plants of many kinds. The larvae feed on those plants. The adult butterflies emerge in late winter. They have a huge reproductive potential, much higher than the monarch, so that they can exploit those winter blooms very effectively and build up huge population sizes. And just like the monarch and just like the tortoiseshell, by moving around, they escape their natural enemies. So the survival rate will be very high from all of that reproduction. The butterflies that result are programmed genetically to migrate north in response, we think, to day length changes, okay? They are provisioned with yellow fat, which they carry over from the caterpillar feeding stage. When you hit one with your windshield, you get a pat of butter on the windshield. That's the fuel that the butterfly was migrating with. Okay, you may have noticed the ones migrating now. They go like bats out of hell, and they go in a straight direction, typically southeast to northwest. And they will not veer from that barrier. If they come to a building, they won't go around it, they go over the top of it. If they come to a forest, they won't go around it or through it, they go over the top of it. Okay? They stay on their barrier. Everything is very carefully genetically built into them and under hormonal control. Okay, next. Okay, again, this has been a really big painted lady year. The timing has been similar to 2005, but the numbers seem to be considerably smaller. How fast do these things move? Well, in the old world, they've been tracked by radar. We haven't done that here, but by having observers along the tracks they're likely to follow, we can follow the front of the migration anecdotally. We know they can make it from Lone Pine to Davis in 3 days. Okay, we know that last week they made it from the Inyo Kern lowland, the Kern River Canyon, to Davis in about 8 days. Okay, so they're really moving. We know they can fly 25 miles an hour, but we don't know how long they can sustain it. We know they can pace a slow-moving car and easily outpace the average bike rider. Okay, next. This is a global phenomenon. Okay, they're not albatross. And remember, this is a generational phenomenon. That is to say, no butterfly of any species ever makes a round trip seasonally. They only go one way. But, if you look at that map, the Stefanescu research group has been studying the migration in the old world because the painted lady is almost cosmopolitan and is genetically the same in Eurasia as it is here. Okay, we used to think that the entire European population went to North Africa for the winter. They go across the Mediterranean, they arrive in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and breed there in the winter the way they do in the desert here. But it turns out that's only part of the population. Part of the population continues south and crosses the Sahara Desert, which they can do in just a few days. And they then breed in the Sahel, in Sierra Leone, Mali, Cameroon, okay, the transition zone between the desert and the rainforest in West Africa. And then their offspring make the return trip across the Sahara and colonize Europe. Absolutely phenomenal. Delicate little creatures, aren't they? Yeah. All right, further east, that arrow right there reflects the fact that the most easterly part of that southern migration in the fall is too far east to go to the Sahel. They go to the Ethiopian highlands to breed in the winter and then come back. They're in Cyprus right now on their way back to continental Europe. They're crossing the Mediterranean. They typically stop on the island of Cyprus, a few million of them, the nectar and so forth. Now, when the migrating butterflies run out of fat, they become interested in sex. They don't stop for anything until they run out of fat. And then they stop, and then they start courting and laying eggs. In Davis, that just began this week. So we had territorial males setting up their stations to meet females within the last few days. And you see the first few eggs being laid. The butterflies resulting from those eggs will hatch again in May. And they'll migrate up to the Pacific Northwest. Next. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. The left is just a radar trace showing how they've been traced using aerial tracking. But the picture on the right was emailed to me by a mountain climber who encountered a swarm of painted ladies at 22,000 feet on Mount K2 in the Himalayas. As of today, that is the highest elevation butterfly record in the world. Okay? They were migrating between the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia on a seasonal basis. And they usually go through lower passes, like 16,000 feet. But 22,000 is pretty remarkable. Next. Okay, the red admiral is another migratory species. In California, it overwinters at low elevation, and we're not sure if it migrates at all in California. But everywhere else in the temperate northern hemisphere, it's a seasonal migrant, like the painted lady. Next. And the common buckeye is a seasonal migrant, although its migrations are very poorly understood. They seem to be irregular in their timing, and we don't know where most of them originate. But we do have records of migrating painted ladies flying over the snowpack at, say, 12,000 feet in the Sierra Nevada in the spring. Next. Before European colonization of California, many butterfly species were adapted to the Mediterranean climate by breeding in the spring near sea level, and then following the spring up the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Range to higher and higher elevations in successive generations. That still goes on today, but it has been modified quite a bit by the introduction of exotic plants that they can breed on and that are available at low elevation in the summer thanks to irrigation. So the historic evolutionary response to Mediterraneanization of the climate, which is only a couple of million years old, is continued, but has already been modified by human activity. And here are just a few more of our familiar butterflies which migrate altitudinally. The mourning pope doesn't migrate altitudinally right here in the coastal fog belt. It'll continue to breed through the summer here. But as soon as you move inland to the east side of the coast ranges, it deserts the low elevations in the summer and moves up to the mountains to breed and then comes back down in the fall. Okay? Quite a few moths, like the striped mourning sphinx on the left, Hyles lineata, and Heliothis floxophagus there, are seasonal migrators. Hyles lineata is an extremely accomplished migrator, next, which routinely crosses the crest of the Sierra Nevada. It doesn't breed there, but again, we see it flying over snow, and we see it flying over the vegetation and nectaring on appropriate plants in the alpine zone as it tracks the availability of rainfall. So in an average year, it will breed west of the Sierra Nevada and the Central Valley, and then migrate over the Sierra and breed in the Great Basin as a result of the monsoonal thunderstorms that induce new plant growth in the desert. And again, there's a return migration. This year, with the tremendous rains in the desert, it's been breeding like crazy down the Southern California deserts in the last few weeks. And in fact, there are reports of large numbers of caterpillars marching around, having eaten everything in sight. They're general feeders, they eat many different plants, and getting squashed on the roads. Next. This is an almost identical moth, Hyles euphorbiarium, which does exactly the same thing in South America. It migrates between the Mediterranean climate of Chile, where it breeds in late winter and spring, and the monsoonal desert climate of western Argentina, flying over the crest of the Andes at 14,000 feet like through that pass right there. Next. And we have a bunch of agricultural and garden pests which are also migrants here in California, like this thing, Helios fluorescens. If you grow petunias or geraniums, you probably had a caterpillar that eats the flowers and causes you anguish. That's it. It's a seasonal migrant. We don't see it in California until July or August, and then it breeds until frost. We don't know if it goes back or not. A few years ago, we had a subtropical species that feeds on lantana that colonized in Davis. We don't know why, how frequently that occurs, but it was very strange to see a moth that eats lantana, say in Nicaragua and Guatemala, eating it in gardens in Davis. Next. Not just butterflies, not just moths, many dragonflies, maybe most dragonflies, are seasonal long-distance migrants. And they have been tracked, for example, across the Indian Ocean. Okay? Our large green darner, Anax junius, a very common dragonfly here, is a long-distance migrant, but we're not really sure where it goes. We know they aggregate often in the Sierra in meadows in September and October in big numbers, and then head south and disappear. Eventually we'll find out where they go. But because they're also common in parts of temperate South America and the inverse season, it may be that they're doing the Swainson's hawk thing and going to Argentina. It would be great to find out. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. You are invited to email me for more information or to ask questions. And do read the handout. Then you know a lot about painted ladies and tortoiseshells. And when someone calls one a monarchy, we will correct them authoritatively.
Couple questions?
Question?
So thorough. Mary?
Yeah, so I have a passion flower in front of my house.
Yeah.
For 2 years in a row, I had gold calarias.
Right.
And then they vanished. So is that probably what's happening?
No.
Is there looking for another source?
Oh, okay. Gulf frits are an extremely interesting story. The Gulf frit is a subtropical and tropical species. We are at the extreme northern limit of its range. It feeds only on Passiflora, passion runners. Not on all species, by the way. It won't eat the redwood Jamesoniana, for example.
Right.
Okay, well, we have no native Passiflora AC in California. So the butterfly can't be native here. It was first reported in California about 1875 in San Diego. It was first reported in the Bay Area about 1910. It has been resident continuously in the Bay Area since at least 1950, entirely dependent on garden plants. Okay? It is frost intolerant. Because of its tropical origins, it has no adaptations for surviving the winter. If the temperature, so you can get all stages in the winter: adults, eggs, larvae, and pupae. If the temperature drops below about 21 to 22 Fahrenheit, they'll be killed outright. So its survival at low elevation in California is patchy and depends on the weather of the year, but it has managed to persist in the Bay Area, as I say now, for about 70 years. Okay? But it comes and goes. Okay, it gets more interesting. We don't know when it arrived in the Sacramento area, but it was breeding in Sacramento in the and Davis in the 1960s. It was frozen out in the early 1970s and went extinct regionally. About 12 or 13 years ago, it mysteriously reappeared in eastern Sacramento County, Carmichael, Fair Oaks, Rancho Cordova, and has spread out from there. And as of last year, its range at low elevation, California inland, extended north to Redding and Red Bluff, south to around Modesto, and upslope in the Sierra foothills to Placerville and Nevada City. Okay? So it has expanded its range tremendously, 100% dependent on cultivated plants. So I don't know why it has disappeared from your area. It'll be interesting to see if it shows up again. It does come and go, but it does not migrate. By the way, talk about philopatry. There has been a breeding population of them on Delaware Avenue in West Berkeley for about 35 years in the same couple of gardens. Okay. Okay, more questions? Yeah.
When talking about the specifics, so for the torties, for example, what are the advantages to having a really specific host plant? It seems like a really risky business.
Well, the tortie, unlike, say, the monarch or the pipeline swallowtail, does not get a chemical advantage from its host specialization. The monarch and the pipeline swallowtail and a number of other butterflies, by specializing on a plant which is highly toxic, appropriate the toxic chemistry, store it, and use it to defend themselves against their own natural enemies. As far as we know, tortoiseshells don't do that. Tortoiseshells are edible. So we're not sure why they're specialized, and interestingly enough, their close relatives are not specialists on ceanothus. Okay?
Are they specialists on something else?
Well, their close relatives in this country are Milbert's tortoiseshell, which eats stinging nettles, and the mourning cloak, which feeds primarily on willow, occasionally on poplar and on hackberry, which is not native in California, but is often grown. Okay? So they're not extreme generalists. Eating nettle does not confer chemical protection. The chemical protection for nettle is actually the stinging hairs, and there's no way that they can be exploited. You know that sea slugs, for example, incorporate stinging cells from their prey and use them for their own defense, but caterpillars can't do that. So I don't know why tortoiseshells are ceanothus specialists. All I know is that if it's a ceanothus, they will eat it. And that even includes the ground cover mahalamat, Ceanothus prostratus. So it doesn't have to be an upright bush. Okay?
Dr. Shapiro, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Angela Wallace. She received her PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 2007. Then she researched how temperature change can affect predator-prey interactions with grassland insects and spiders. She has been with the Circe Society since 2018 as an expert on monarch and pollinator ecology. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to talk about monarchs. But I did think about going rogue and talking about grasshoppers. One person. So I work with the Circe Society. I've been with them for a year. We're a nonprofit focused on invertebrate conservation, and our name comes from the Xerces blue, which is the first butterfly known to have gone extinct in the US. We have programs, most of our staff work with pollinators, But we have an endangered species team. We do work on pesticide reduction. We do some work in aquatic conservation. We do a lot of outreach, but also on the ground restoration. So most of our staff in California do work with farmers to put hedgerows and other habitat on their farms to benefit pollinators and other insects. So the monarch life cycle here, monarchs are specialists on milkweed, which you probably know. So the caterpillars have to feed on milkweed species in order to develop into adults. The eggs you can see here are laid individually on the milkweeds, and they take about 3 to 5 days to hatch. And this is a picture of this tiny guy as a first instar larvae. So the caterpillars go through 5 instars before forming a chrysalis. And during this time, they feed exclusively on milkweed. And they sequester these toxins, which we just heard about, these cardinalites that make them toxic to predators. And this, the larval stage lasts about 2 weeks. There's some really cool old pictures of blue jays. So the way they figured out that the monarchs were toxic was they fed the caterpillars to birds, and then there's all these great pictures of blue jays like picking up caterpillars, which is lots of fun. So the pupal stage, again, lasts 10 to 14 days. So from egg to adults is about 28 days. And they're really beautiful. This gold and black line is called a diadem. Any Harry Potter fans in the house? So it's in the last book. It's like a tiara. I wouldn't have known that word except for Harry Potter. Okay, so this is a monarch migration. There are generally 2 populations. Okay, so there's the eastern monarchs. They breed east of the Rocky Mountains and overwinter in central Mexico in the Llano firs. And the western monarchs breed west of the Rocky Mountains and overwinter along the California coast, as you guys know because you're right here. So there is some mixing. These populations aren't genetically distinct. And until recently, we know much less about the western monarch population than we do about the eastern monarchs. And so we're learning more, but there's still a lot we don't know about their phenology and biology. Phenology is the timing of biological events, so when they mature, when they breed, when do they get to Nevada or Idaho, for example. So this is a model we worked on with one of Art Shapiro's former grad students to look at where the best places are for monarchs. So the western monarchs occur throughout the west, but these red areas are the best areas for monarchs, or the key parts of their range. A lot of this is based on temperature, but also places that are good for milkweed, which they need, right? So we see here in California, the Central Valley and along the coast are really important parts of their range. But they can lay eggs from the US through Canada, of course. Milkweed is important. There are about 72 species of milkweed in the US, about 44 in the western US, and here in California we have 15. Monarchs have been documented using about 20 of these. The reason we don't know about all of them is because some of these milkweeds are very rare, so we just don't have records of monarchs using these, but they probably use most of these milkweeds. So a handful of them are commercially available. Narrowleaf milkweed and showy milkweed are the 2 that are most commonly found in nurseries. So the monarchs use milkweed for a variety of ways. It's an oviposition site, it's the primary or only larval food source, the pupal formation site, they'll use milkweed for that, and then the adults will use it as a nectar source. So while the caterpillars only feed on milkweed, the adults are generalists, and they'll take nectar from a variety of plants, but they will use milkweed. And a lot of other species of insects will also use milkweed, and birds will use the stems for their nests. Okay, so during the overwinter, the monarchs show up on the California coast. And these circles represent known overwintering sites of monarchs, and they form these clusters. And they're looking for microclimate conditions, like these prime conditions, so that they're protected from the wind, protected from freezing temperatures, but that also aren't too warm. If it gets too hot, they start burning up their energy reserves. And they also need adequate nectar sources and humidity. So they go into a reproductive diapause. So what happens is that they emerge from the overwintering sites, they breed, successive generations breed, and then in the fall, that last generation flies all the way back to the overwintering sites. They overwinter, and then that same group is the one that is the first group that starts to breed in the spring. So that throughout the whole winter, they're in reproductive diapause, they're not reproducing. But they will fly short distances to take nectar and to stretch their wings in the sun. So how do we determine how big the monarch population is? Well, the best way is to wait until they form these clusters because they're all in one place instead of spread out across the continent, right? So it's easier to get a handle on how large the population is. So you see, this is a picture of the trees they use in central Mexico, and you can see how the trees look dead, they're brown, they're senescing. Those are the monarchs. That's how thick they get. And so the way they measure the eastern population is to estimate the number of acres that the monarchs are using in the overwintering sites. Here along the coast, we have the Thanksgiving count. So Xerces helps to organize this count. It's completely run by volunteers. Is anyone here one of our volunteers? Okay, well oh yeah, great. Yeah, without the volunteers, we wouldn't have these data because they're all spread out. What they do is and Mia Monroe, she's amazing. She's with the U.S. National Park Service. She helps us coordinate this as well. And so volunteers go out, they go out to these different sites for 2 weeks around Thanksgiving, and they count the number of butterflies that they can see in a grove. That they're always in pairs, so there's always at least 2 people counting. And then they also make some measurements about the habitat. So we get an idea of how many monarchs are at each of these overwintering sites. And then in 2017, we started the New Year's count. So we went back again to these sites and counting them again in New Year's. So we can see how the populations are changing in the overwintering sites during the winter. So what's happened is so this green, let's look at this graph. So we have total monarch abundance is plotted here against time. So we have from 1997 when the Thanksgiving count started to 2018. And so the green bars are telling us how many butterflies we found. So in 1997, there were 1.2 million butterflies counted in the Thanksgiving count. And there are other data that we have, not through these counts, but from other censuses that suggests that in the 1980s there were about 4.5 million butterflies overwintering on the coast. You can see these numbers have dropped and hovered around 200,000 for a long time. And then this last year, the numbers dropped again about 86% to less than 30,000 butterflies. So last winter, or 2017, there were 192,000 monarchs at 262 sites. And then last year, 28,429 monarchs at 213 sites. That's an 86% drop. It's a 99.4% drop from the high in the 1980s. This blue line is the number of sites monitored. So you can see that over time, as we get more fantastic volunteers, we're able to monitor more sites. The sites were lower this year because of the fires. So as we're counting more sites, the numbers have been kind of steady, which means at each site we're getting fewer and fewer butterflies, right? So we're getting these huge declines in their numbers. And I should mention our Shapiro's censuses in the breeding grounds have also found these decreases in their population size. So to put that in perspective, for Californians anyway. It's like the population of LA shrinking to the size of Monterey, and this little dot would be like to scale the size of the population shrinking. So it's a big decline. And I guess one thing I want to say about that is that what's happening with monarchs isn't unique. As Dr. Shapiro pointed out, many butterflies are declining. There have been several studies published in the last few years describing huge decreases in insect abundance and diversity around the globe. So it's a huge problem. Biodiversity in general is declining. With monarchs, why this is happening is sort of the usual suspects, right? The same things that are often come up when we talk about why a species is declining are operating here as well. So habitat loss is a big one. Loss of the overwintering grounds and degradation of the overwintering grounds. About 50 or so overwintering sites have been lost in the last few years mainly to development, but also with the drought can weaken the trees get sick. Loss of habitat in the breeding grounds as well. So this includes loss of milkweed. There's some it's a bit ambiguous as to how important the loss of milkweed is to the western monarchs. We do know that there's not as much milkweed as there used to be in the Central Valley. So there are parts of the western range that we think that milkweed is really important to plant. And the Central Valley is one of those. But it's not as clear, for example, in Nevada, if milkweed is actually limiting there. But we do know that habitat loss in the breeding grounds is important. Insecticides and pesticide use in general is a big problem here. I think that a lot of people, when they think about pesticide use, they think of agriculture, and certainly monarchs are passing through the Central Valley where they're being exposed to pesticides. But urban areas can have high or higher uses of pesticides in agricultural areas. And so it's important to think about that. And that includes neonicotinoids. So these are systemic pesticides that stay in the environment for months or even years. So if you spray neonicotinoids, or for example, if you plant a plant that's been treated with neonics, and then you plant it, it stays in the soil. New plants that you plant can also take it up. And so for months, that plant can be releasing those toxins. Of course, climate change, which you've heard a lot about, is a problem with monarchs as well. And then we can see parasites and disease. Predators can also play a role. So this is our call to action, things we can do to help western monarchs. So protecting and managing California's overwintering sites is one of the top ones. So preventing sites from being lost to logging or development, but also managing them better so that trees can be replaced if there are sick trees, or trees that are diseased can be replaced so that those groves aren't lost. Restoring breeding and migratory habitat in California is important. So we're lucky here in California, right? This is a key part of our habitat, so the work that we do can really make a really important effect, or have an important impact on monarch conservation. Protecting monarchs and their habitat from pesticides, and then of course protecting and managing summer breeding habitat outside of California is also important, but we call out California in particular because it is really important. And then continuing research. There's still a lot we don't know about the biology of monarchs, and the more we learn, the better we can fine-tune our management decisions. And so the better chance we have of protecting this species, because we'll know more about what they're doing and why they're declining. And the other thing that I would add to this is taking action on climate change. We've heard about that with some of the other talks, but if we don't keep the magnitude of warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, then I'm concerned that we'll lose a lot more than monarchs. So I think that that's also important. In terms of protecting overwintering sites, so each year Some overwintering sites are destroyed or damaged by human actions like development, or sometimes just inappropriate tree trimming because people just don't know that monarchs are there, because, so they'll do the management in the summer, right? And when the monarchs aren't there, so they just don't know that they have monarchs. And sometimes that can lead to abandonment of the site because the butterflies are looking for really specific conditions. More than 50 overwintering sites have been lost. I said this. We continue to lose sites, and the senescence of groves and lack of management is a problem. So actively trying to advocate for overwintering sites in your area is something that can really make a difference for monarch conservation. Protecting the overwintering sites includes halting the destruction and development of management plans. So Emma Pelton is one of our biologists at Xerces, and she's an expert on this. She's been working with a couple of state parks to develop management plans for their overwintering sites. Habitat needs, because you guys, I think, are close to some of these sites, they need wooded areas that are protected from wind, and they also need nectar plants. So these are a few. We think that nectar plants are really important, especially early in the spring and late in the fall during the migration. So these are a couple of nectar plants that might be good choices. So for early spring, blue dicks are an early blooming species. Manzanitas are great, they're out early in the winter. Highleaf cherry is another example. And seaside fleabane. Baccharis is another great monarch plant. In the fall, things that are blooming late into the fall so that they'll still be those nectar sources when monarchs are coming back in October to the overwintering site include golden top, and solidatos are also great. Gumweed is another one, it's really drought tolerant. Summer lupine. Lupines are great for many butterflies and bees. A lot of these are just great pollinator plants in general, and vinegar weed. So these are some examples. We have lots of plant lists on our website. We have a new one for the Central Coast that has plants that are great for bees, butterflies, and monarchs. And then, of course, restoring breeding habitats. So it's important to keep in mind that the breeding and the overwintering habitats are different, and the butterflies have different needs in these different habitats. So the areas we're especially interested in are the coastal range, the Sierra Nevada and the Central Valley. And these areas need native milkweeds. So this is the prime food plant for the caterpillars, so it's important to include. But we also need nectar plants in these areas. And again, this early spring and late fall nectar plants I think are really important. And safe habitat that's protected from pesticides, high levels of pathogens. There is evidence that high levels of one particular pathogen builds up on tropical milkweed because in areas where it doesn't die back, like in Southern California, the butterflies transfer the disease to the tropical milkweed and it can build up. And they'll use other features like shade for perching and water. Reducing pesticide use overall is important, halting the use of neonicotinoids. I talked about that a little bit. They're systemic, they stay in the environment for a long time. A lot of times if you buy plants from a nursery, just ask them if they pre-treat. So there's some places will just automatically pre-treat all of their plants with neonicotinoids to prevent herbivory. So if you just ask at the nursery whether or not they pre-treat, you can avoid using those plants, at least in areas that you're going to provide habitat for monarchs or other butterflies or pollinators. And of course we want to answer key research questions so that we can improve our management suggestions. So we have a couple of citizen science efforts that you can help out with. The Thanksgiving and New Year's counts are something that we always love to have volunteers help with. But we also have the monarch and milkweed mapper. So this is a citizen science project. The app is kind of clunky, but you can make it work or you can do it just through a computer. So if you take a picture, if you see a monarch or a milkweed in any stage, take a picture of it and then upload it to the site. So one of the issues is that milkweed can The most common milkweeds that we have, the showy milkweed and the narrowleaf milkweed, don't emerge until later in the spring, like usually April. But the monarchs have all left. And so we monitor monarchs during the breeding season, and we monitor them in that overwintering site, and there's this black box where we don't know what they're doing between when they leave the overwintering sites and when they start breeding, so like right now. So we need more information about what they're doing. So records that you submit now are especially valuable. Yeah, just as much data as we can get. We can get more information about what they're doing, when they're doing it, and make better management decisions. There are a couple of other projects as well, citizen science projects, that you can participate in. Journey North, there are some other programs that do tagging, so they just put these little stickers on their wings, and then they look for the wings, the stickers during the Thanksgiving counts. The monarch larvae monitoring project is another example. This project Monarch Health is looking at that disease I talked about, the OE. They have these, it's kind of funny, they have these clear round stickers, and they just stick it to the butterfly's abdomen and pull it off, and then stick it on a note card and mail it into this lab where they can look at it under a microscope and see if they've got these parasites. So that's a way, and if we encourage people especially to do that if they're rearing butterflies. This is a good way to get some data from that, either by tagging or measuring for the diseases. And of course, so that's all I'm going to say. I just wanted to thank our donors that make all of our members make all of our work possible. Thank you.
So the call to action list you had there, how much of that applies to, or where in San Mateo County would you say, you know, that activity?
So our rule of thumb for for overwintering versus breeding, we say 5 miles from the coast just to make it easy. But if you're within about 5 miles of an overwintering site, I would call that overwintering. And if you're not, if you're more than 5 miles away, I would call that breeding ground. In terms of like planting milkweed. Otherwise, you can always plant nectar plants. That's always going to help. Not using pesticide is going to help throughout the range. Does that answer your question?
Or are there significant numbers of what did you call it,
overwintering sites?
Overwintering sites in San Mateo County?
You know what? I haven't looked at the map.
Okay.
So I can find out and let you know. I should have looked. But they're scattered throughout. And there's a lot, like, there's over 400 that have been known historically, but we're only, like last year, our volunteers monitored 213. So there's a lot we just can't get to every year. Some of them are private land. Yeah. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about eucalyptus trees and overwintering sites and?
Yeah, so they use eucalyptus. They'll use a variety of trees, and the eucalyptus is generally short-lived. It is susceptible to disease. One thing that happened with this long drought is a lot of the eucalyptus got sick and started to die. And so in our management plans, one of the things we try to do is use a variety of different trees so that there is a disease that's not going to wipe out the whole grove. And then trying to put in wind breaks, because the wind is a really important thing. If one or two key trees gets knocked down, it can create these wind funnels and just kind of knock the monarchs out of the trees. Sometimes into the road or something like that. And so it's important to think about, you know, when we're doing these management plans, you know, what are the appropriate tree species to use, maybe trying to use several different trees. The eucalyptus grows fast, so that's an advantage if you're trying to replace a grove where the tree has been cut down, or trees have fallen down. So it's always a mix, and we try and come up with management prescriptions that are sort of site specific. So what's going to work best in a certain area.
I think there's one thing people do is plant this milkweed. And I heard, I guess, San Francisco is recommending now, like, not to plant milkweed, but sure is milkweed.
So we're telling people not to plant milkweed next to overwintering sites. And we recommend against planting tropical milkweed, which is not native. So tropical milkweed doesn't, in warm areas, it doesn't senesce in the winter. Most milkweed dies back. So what happens is the butterfly lands on the tropical milkweed, they transfer the OE, that disease, and then the next butterfly comes and can pick it up. When milkweeds die back, the OE dies with it, but because the tropical milkweed doesn't die, it can build up. And so from that, that project, Monarch Health, what we find is in pockets where there's lots of tropical milkweed in warm areas like Southern California, Houston, Florida, there's really high levels of that disease. And with climate changes, we're getting warmer winters. We now have times when even the native milkweeds don't always senesce. So that's a problem. We are a conservation organization, so we always advocate for native plants. So that's part of it. And there are now starting to be reports of butterflies breeding during the overwintering season, and that seems to be related to tropical milkweed. And so trying to also preserve this behavior, the migratory behavior, where if the butterflies generally don't reproduce during the overwintering cycle, but sometimes we're not sure what the cue is, but it seems to be that they're breaking diapause and reproducing in the middle of winter, and normally they wouldn't be. So that's one of the concerns. But did it confuse you more?
Well, as far as the tropical milkweed, it seems like you wouldn't use that anywhere. You just don't even bother with tropical milkweed, so that's out. But as far as the place about what they do in San Francisco, like you still would put it, the native milkweed, San Mateo maybe, but not.
We're saying if it's really close to an overwintering grove, we don't plant it really close to an overwintering grove. But farther inland, I think it's okay. The trouble with tropical milkweed is that it's really easy to grow, right? And the native species are kind of a pain to get growing.
And just to clarify, you sort of, you mentioned as in within 5 miles of the coast.
Yeah, that's our rule of thumb, because otherwise we get a million emails like, I live here.
Right. So avoid planting milkweed within 5 miles of the coast.
Yeah, that's our rule of thumb.
In this region.
Yeah.
And no tropical milkweed.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification.
Yeah, he's gonna.
The tropical milkweed has been in cultivation in California for about 100 years. The winter breeding has only begun in the last decade or so. It started in Southern California. It's going in the East and South Bay now. There are butterflies breeding in the winter. They are supposed to go into reproductive dormancy as a response to the changing day lengths. And an increasing percentage of them are not doing it at all. It's not that they're breaking diapause, they're not entering diapause, and we don't understand it. But I think most people suspect it's a function of climate change. At any rate, tropical milkweed itself does not induce winter breeding, it only enables it. If there's no tropical milkweed, there's no place for them to lay their eggs.
Right.
What they would do then, if they're not in diapause, is a good question. But the ones that are breeding don't join the clusters, they act like it's summer.
There is a recent study from Texas looking at populations of monarchs where there are tropical milkweed and where there aren't. And so what they find is that the ones where there is tropical milkweed, they have like this year-round population of monarchs. And then out where there are no tropical milkweeds, they don't have that. And the monarchs that come through, so the year-round populations have higher levels of this OE. So what they find is the disease. So when the monarchs are coming in, they're picking up the disease, and some of them are moving into reproductive, they are breaking diapause. Whereas in the areas without tropical milkweed, most of the butterflies that are coming through are not reproductively active. So I mean, Art's right, there's a lot we don't know. There seems to be shifting cues, and then you have climate change and warmer winters, this changing things. And I do worry about the overwintering sites. One more, okay.
So I remember as a child, we always find caterpillars everywhere, and now there's very few. I mean, if you find a caterpillar, it's like winning the lotto. And so why is that? I mean, is it all butterfly species are in decline?
I mean, I think it's habitat loss, it's pesticide use, it's climate change. Like, it's this mix of bad things. And the problem is that these factors interact with each other, right? So maybe exposure to a pesticide isn't that bad, but that in combination with a heat wave or in combination with a storm or bad conditions or loss of habitat could become lethal. So it's these interacting factors.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laws. That wraps up Active San Mateo 2019. It takes a village to do all this stuff, and I really want to thank my team, Judah and Gina and Ricky, and especially Susie. Susie put all of this together, contacted you, organized the whole thing, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. So we'll be back next year. If you have ideas, email them to us. We're already working on thoughts for next year. And again, so many of you who have been here the whole time we've been doing this. Can't thank you enough for, and loved having you today. And we'll see you soon.